Welcome to Terrified Tales, where things are about to get unsettling. Before we dive deeper into the darkness, make sure to like and subscribe. Let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. Are you brave enough to be here at night? Now, relax and let the fear take hold. The relentless storm arrived with no warning, the skies swelling with dark, bruised clouds, swallowing the sun whole. Sophie's boots sank into the damp forest floor as she trudged deeper into the thick, oppressive rainforest. Each step felt heavier than the last, the humidity curling around her like a vice. The air tasted of wet earth and moss, thick with the smell of decay. There was something suffocating about the stillness of it all. The unnerving silence punctuated only by the steady drumming of rain against her raincoat and the occasional distant rustle of unseen creatures. She had come here for research, studying the rare birds and insects that called this wild place home. Yet something about the forest unnerved her, a strange pull that left her feeling as though she was being watched, even though she saw nothing but the endless blur of rain and fog. She paused to adjust her equipment, feeling a strange pressure in her chest, an inexplicable discomfort gnawing at her. Why hadn't she been able to shake that sense of being followed? As the rain grew heavier, Sophie looked around, suddenly uneasy. The dense canopy above no longer shielded her from the water, and the wind began to howl through the trees, bending them at odd angles. Then, through the haze of mist, Sophie saw him, a figure standing motionless in the downpour. The man was soaked to the bone, but that wasn't what struck her. It was the stillness of him, the unnaturalness. He didn't move, didn't react to the storm that drenched him. Her heart skipped a beat as she hesitated. Was he lost? Was he in need of help? "Hey!" Sophie called out, her voice nearly swallowed by the storm. The figure did not budge. His clothes, dark and worn, seemed strangely old, decades old, maybe more. A patchwork of fabric clung to his frame, tattered and faded by years of exposure to the elements. His skin, pale as ash, seemed almost waxen, and his eyes were fixed, staring, straight ahead, unblinking. Sophie's throat tightened. "Are you okay?" she called again, but her voice trembled as it broke through the air. No response. She stepped forward slowly, with caution, unsure if she should approach, but a sense of obligation tugged at her. She couldn't leave him out here in this storm, not when he looked so strange. His feet didn't even seem to be sinking into the mud beneath him, like he was standing atop it, floating almost. How could that be? Her pulse quickened. She reached out, her hand hovering just an inch from his arm, yet the moment her fingers brushed the damp air around him, the man shifted, a subtle step backward, as if to avoid her touch. "Are you hurt?" Sophie asked, her voice barely a whisper against the storm, but again there was no answer, not a flicker of a reaction. Just those eyes, those unblinking, hollow eyes. Sophie's stomach churned. Something was wrong, very wrong. It was like the man wasn't even real, like he was a part of the landscape, a piece of the forest itself. She opened her mouth to speak again, but before the words could form, a strange, guttural sound rose from his throat. It was soft at first, almost like a sigh, but it lingered in the air, heavy and distorted, as though the sound itself wasn't entirely his. Sophie froze. The man's eyes shifted, not to look at her, but to something beyond her. The air grew, heavier with tension, the smell of wet earth and decay suffocating. The wind seemed to pause, the storm stilled for a moment, and then a sound. Footsteps, soggy and slow, a squelch of wet shoes against the earth. Sophie turned, but when she looked back at the man, he was gone. Where had he gone? Her heart hammered against her ribs as the footsteps continued, growing closer and closer. The air turned icy. Sophie spun around again, frantically scanning the trees, but the figure was nowhere to be seen. only the relentless rain. Had she imagined him? Her breath quickened. There was no time to waste. She needed to get back to the tent. But as she turned to go, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was following her. The footsteps were behind her now, just beyond her reach. The rain hit harder, as if the heavens themselves had unleashed all their fury at once. Sophie's breath came in jagged gasps as she sprinted through the dense, dripping underbrush, her feet slipping and sliding in the muck beneath her. Each time her boots sank into the wet earth, she felt herself being pulled deeper into the forest, deeper into something she couldn't yet comprehend. Her mind raced, heart pounding in her chest. What had she seen? That man, standing so eerily still, had he ever been real? No, she refused to believe it. Yet the feeling of those damp footsteps following her, the sound of wet shoes dragging through the mud just out of sight, was unmistakable. It was real. It had been real. She reached the edge of the forest, the thick canopy parting into a small clearing where her tent waited. Relief, momentary, washed over her. The flickering silhouette of her camp looked like a beacon, offering some sense of safety. Sophie stumbled toward it, her pulse still racing, her mind clouded with dread. The rain poured down in sheets as she reached the tent, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the zipper. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was just behind her, watching from the shadows. The footsteps were closer now, the wet squelching so distinct that it felt as though the sound was inside her head. Sophie finally wrestled open the zipper, her body jerking inside, heart hammering against her ribs. She collapsed onto the ground, the sodden floor of the tent feeling like a sanctuary against the chaos outside. But the unease didn't fade. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the figure standing just outside the tent, watching her, waiting. The footsteps stopped. A heavy silence filled the tent, broken only by the sound of Sophie's ragged breath. She strained her ears, listening, hoping for the rain to drown out the unease creeping up her spine. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, but just as her shoulders began to relax, the unmistakable sound returned. The footsteps, slow, deliberate. A chill ran through her as the soggy sound circled the tent, the soft sloshing of mud-filled boots growing nearer with every pass. Sophie's heart thudded in her throat. The footsteps weren't stopping. They never stopped. She froze, her fingers gripping the zipper of the tent, ready to close it at any moment. She didn't dare make a sound. Every instinct screamed at her. To bolt out of the tent, to flee the forest entirely, but she couldn't. Something was out there, and it was waiting. The footsteps grew louder, closer, too close. Then suddenly, the rain ceased. Sophie's breath caught in her throat, the unnatural stillness hanging in the air like a suffocating blanket. For a moment, she thought her mind was playing tricks on her. But when she lifted her head to the tent's opening, she could see nothing. Nothing but mist. The footsteps stopped. No sound, no movement. Her pulse raced again, her breath coming in shallow gasps. There was no mistaking it. Someone was outside, but no one was there. She dared to peer through the small gap in the tent, her eyes straining against the shadows. Nothing. The heavy silence seemed to grow with every passing second, the forest pressing in from all sides, suffocating her. Then came the sound again. But this time it wasn't from the direction she expected. The soggy footsteps weren't circling the tent anymore. They were right outside it, at the entrance. They stopped. The wet shoes just inches from the fabric, and Sophie felt her body freeze with terror. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as the silence grew unbearable. Then, the tent flap jerked. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. It was as if an unseen hand had grabbed the edge of the fabric and yanked it open. The flaps fluttered for a split second, and then nothing. Her body screamed at her to look, to see what was out there, but she couldn't. Fear held her like an invisible chain. Her mind raced, spinning with all the possibilities of what could be lurking in the storm. The footsteps. Where had they gone? For one long, suffocating moment, there was only the sound of the rain. Sophie held her breath. The air felt thicker now, colder, as though the very atmosphere was pressing in on her. Her hands trembled violently as she reached for the flashlight. She had to know. Sophie flicked the switch, the beam of light cutting through the dark, flashing. Against the tent's opening. The footsteps, the sounds of movement. They were gone. But as the light swept across the ground, her heart nearly stopped. There, in the mud, leading from the entrance of her tent, were the unmistakable marks of wet, soggy footprints, and they led inside. The flashlight shook in Sophie's hand, its beam cutting through the darkness of the tent as her eyes locked on the wet prints that marred the dry ground inside. No, this isn't happening. Her heart pounded in her chest, the sound almost deafening in the eerie silence that had descended. She had been alone when she entered the tent, hadn't she? She had heard no one approach. There had been no noise except the rain, no footsteps except her own. Yet now the prints were there, trailing across the floor like a ghost's path. Sophie's breath caught in her throat, her body stiffening. Her instincts screamed for her to run, to tear down the tent and flee into the night. But her limbs were frozen, a deep primal fear holding her in place. They were wet, soaked, like something had just walked through a storm and had come inside. Yet when she inspected the prints more closely, they didn't make sense. They were uneven, like the person or thing was dragging one foot behind. And the strange thing was, they weren't just on the floor. The damp trail spiraled upward, as if the prints were rising along the wall. Sophie's eyes widened. The air in the tent turned heavier, thicker and colder. It felt like the storm was creeping inside, its oppressive humidity pressing against her skin, smothering her breath. She reached down and touched the print with trembling fingers. The moment her skin made contact, the ground beneath her seemed to shudder, as though the very earth had flinched at her touch. The flashlight flickered. Sophie gasped, jerking her hand back. The beam sputtered, casting sharp, jagged shadows across the inside of the tent. She slammed the flashlight against her palm, desperate to get it working again, but the light barely held. A low, eerie hum began to fill the space, faint but growing, louder, like the buzz of a distant, unseen engine turning on. Sophie's breathing quickened, her vision blurred, eyes darting across the tent. What was happening? Her gaze swept to the tent entrance again, and then back to the footprints. She had to force herself to look away, but it was like they were calling to her. The trail led straight toward her bag, straight toward the things she needed to survive. Her supplies, her maps, her journal. And then, out of the corner of her eye, Sophie saw movement. A shadow. No, the shadow in the corner of the tent didn't make sense. There was no one else in the tent with her, and yet the blackness in the corner stretched and swayed like the wind was tugging at it. The shadow was unnatural, wrong. It was too solid to be a part of the rain-soaked night outside. It seemed to pulse, almost alive. Sophie's mind raced. There was no way this could be real. The shadow, the footsteps, the man outside. He had to be connected to this. But how? The hum in the air grew louder now, vibrating her teeth. Sophie stumbled to her feet, unable to tear her gaze away from the corner. The shadow seemed to shift toward her, as though it was coming closer, moving faster than it should. She could feel its presence pressing in on her, a weight too heavy for her lungs to bear. A low, rasping voice filled her ears, barely above a whisper, but it was so close she could feel it in her chest. Come closer. Her stomach lurched. Her eyes darted to the tent entrance again, but the flap remained securely fastened. Still, the voice, it wasn't from outside. It was inside her head. Sophie's hand trembled as she reached for her knife, tucked in the side pocket of her bag. She had no idea what she was about to face, but the primal fear that flooded her veins told her she needed to be prepared. The voice, that voice continued to whisper, urging her closer to the corner, closer to the shadow, closer, closer. Sophie gritted her teeth, forcing herself to stand tall to take control. She had been trained for this, trained to understand and study the unknown. She could fight whatever this was. She could make it out alive. With a single, swift movement, Sophie slashed the air with the knife, desperate to sever whatever grip the shadow had on her. But the blade passed through it, like cutting through a thick mist. It didn't make sense. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably. The hum grew louder. The air thickened. The shadow swelled, growing, rippling, until it was no longer a shadow at all. It became a form, tall and twisted, a figure that was not fully human, a silhouette of something ancient, something wrong. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, eyes that mirrored the same unblinking stare of the man she had seen outside. Sophie's blood ran cold. No. She stumbled back, clutching the knife tighter, but her feet wouldn't obey. She was stuck, frozen in place, her body unwilling to move, as if the air itself was thick with an invisible force that held her captive. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky, unnatural, like something out of a nightmare, its long limbs stretching toward her, and then, in the stillness of the tent, the voice spoke again. "You should have left." The weight of those words settled on her chest like a boulder, and the world around her seemed to shift. The tent walls started to collapse inward, the air now suffocating, thick with the smell of decay and rot. Sophie's mind spun, and for the first time since her arrival she felt utterly alone, utterly lost in a place that defied all reason. Her hand reached for the zipper of the tent, but when she tried to pull it open, nothing happened. It wouldn't budge. The tent seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing tighter, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and rotting leaves. Sophie's heart hammered in her chest, the sound nearly deafening as she gasped for breath. She tried to pull at the zipper again, her fingers slick with sweat and desperation, but the tent didn't give. It was as if the fabric itself had become part of the forest, fused with the very land she had wandered into. The shadowed figure loomed before her, its long limbs now coiling like serpents, twitching in unnatural patterns. It was taller than a man, too tall, and as it reached toward her, its hands, they weren't hands at all. They were elongated, with fingers that seemed to stretch and bend in grotesque, jagged angles. The tips of its fingers shimmered in the dim light, glistening like wet stone, and she realized with a sickening jolt that they weren't just wet. They were covered in something thicker, something dark and viscous, like sap or blood. Sophie's body trembled uncontrollably as she stepped back, every instinct screaming at her to run, but the fear was paralyzing. She wanted to scream, but her voice was stuck, locked in her throat as the figure crept closer. The humming sound had turned into a low, menacing growl, vibrating through the ground beneath her, a sound that made her bones ache in sympathy. The thing was almost upon her, its cold, moist breath coming in ragged bursts that made the air shiver. Sophie's fingers tightened around the knife, but when she lifted it, her arms felt heavy, like she was moving through water. It was as though the air itself was pushing back, forcing her to remain still. And then it spoke. "Why are you afraid?" Its voice was a twisted mockery of a human's, like something that had been stolen from the earth itself. It was low, grating, and carried a strange, awful weight, like it was coming from a place far deeper than the physical world. Sophie's knees buckled, but she held herself upright, refusing to let the thing see her break. Her mind raced as she tried to think, to understand what was happening, the man outside, the footprints, the voice in her head. This thing before her, was it connected to him? What do you want from me? Her voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, but it felt like a victory to even speak. The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it tilted its head at an odd angle, its eyes gleaming with a predatory light. You came for the truth. But the truth is not meant for you. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. The truth. She could feel it, deep in her gut. A sense of knowing that she had been drawn here for a reason. Her research had led her to the most remote parts of the rainforest, looking for something, anything, that could explain the strange patterns of the ecosystem she had been studying. But it wasn't just about the wildlife anymore, was it? It had never been. The thing's lips curled upward in a sickening semblance of a smile. It knew what she was thinking. You have learned too much. You sought the forest's secrets, but it has claimed you now. Sophie's mind reeled. The storm outside, the wet footprints, the man, it was all connected to this. She had thought she was simply studying nature, cataloguing species and behaviors, but now she realized too late that there had been something else, something ancient, something that lived in the very bones of the rainforest. The forest had a will of its own, a hunger, and it had lured her in. No, I'm not, Sophie stammered, but the figure's laugh interrupted her, a low, crackling sound that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. It wasn't a laugh, really. It was a sound that seemed to tear through the air itself like 1,000 whispers woven into one grotesque noise. You are already part of it. And then, with a sudden sharp movement, it reached out toward her, its long fingers curling like vines. Sophie screamed, but the sound was lost in the suffocating air. She swung the knife at the figure, but it passed right through it, the blade sinking into nothing. It was like trying to cut through smoke. And yet, as it touched, a jolt of cold shot up her arm, an icy sensation that made her teeth ache. A feeling of despair settled over her, heavy and dark, as she realized the truth in its words. It wasn't just a shadow. It wasn't even a ghost. This thing was part of the forest, part of the rainforest's curse. It had been here long before Sophie, and it would remain long after her. She was nothing but a trespasser in a place where the land itself consumed, where the rain whispered secrets that twisted minds and souls alike. Suddenly, the pressure on her chest eased, and the figure paused, as though watching her struggle with the truth. Sophie's breathing slowed, the pounding in her head now steady, like a drumbeat. You think you can escape? Sophie's pulse quickened. Again, but this time it wasn't from fear, it was from something else. A thought. She could escape. Not from the figure, but from the forest itself. She wasn't trapped here physically. She was trapped mentally. With a fierce resolve, Sophie gripped the knife tighter and forced herself to take a step back. The figure flinched, just for a second, before it resumed its creeping, otherworldly movement toward her. But Sophie no longer felt helpless. She knew something it didn't. "I am not yours," she muttered, her voice trembling but stronger than before. The shadow figure hesitated, as if her words had struck a chord. Sophie took another step back, this time her feet moving of their own accord, pulling her toward the back of the tent. But when she turned to flee, the tent's walls squeezed in tighter, the fabric twisting like roots, and before she could reach the zipper again, the shadows closed in. The figure grinned wider, its eyes narrowing with wicked satisfaction. There is no escape. But Sophie's heart did not falter. She would find a way out. The truth didn't bind her. She wouldn't let it. The shadows pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, as though the very fabric of the tent had become part of the dark creature that loomed in front of her. Sophie's breath came in shallow gasps, her fingers trembling against the knife, her body locked in a paralyzing struggle. The thing in front of her was so close now, too close. Its elongated limbs reached forward like vines, dripping with moisture, each movement slow, deliberate, like it was savoring her fear. But Sophie's mind raced, finding a sliver of clarity amid the chaos. The thing was not invincible. It was tied to this place, just as she had unwittingly become. The forest, the storm, the strange man she had seen earlier, it was all part of a cycle. A force that devoured and trapped anyone foolish enough to seek the truth about it. But she wouldn't be another victim. She couldn't afford to be. Sophie glanced around the tent, searching desperately for something, anything, that could give her an edge. Her eyes fell on the small medical kit, the survival tools, the jar of fire-starting matches she'd carelessly left next to her gear. Matches. The idea bloomed in her mind like a dangerous seed. She had one advantage: fire. The figure took another, stepped forward, the sound of its feet dragging across the ground, the wet slapping noise sending a cold shiver through her spine. It was so close now, the air around it thick with its scent, a putrid blend of rot and decay. Sophie could feel the weight of its presence on her skin, could almost feel the moisture seeping into her clothes, as though the thing itself was trying to drown her in its own bleak, suffocating atmosphere. Sophie's fingers were already reaching for the matches before she realized what she was doing. Her body moved of its own accord, a frantic impulse to survive overriding every ounce of rational thought. Her hands shook so violently that it took several attempts to light the first match. When it finally flared to life, she almost dropped it in her panic. The match flared bright, its orange glow casting sharp, flickering shadows over the walls of the tent, making the figure's grotesque form writhe and shift. Sophie swallowed hard and, without thinking, tossed the match onto the dry kindling of leaves and paper she'd gathered earlier in case of an emergency. The small flame ignited, instantly sparking with life. She felt a strange sense of relief, watching as the fire crackled, warming the cold air around her. But the figure, it wasn't afraid. Instead, it leaned closer, its face now just inches from hers. Its eyes, glowing like the dim embers of dying coals, were fixed on her with a predatory intensity. Its lips parted slightly, revealing rows of jagged teeth that were more like jagged, glistening roots than anything human. A low hiss emerged from the thing, and for the first time, Sophie realized it wasn't just a being, it was hunger itself. The air around the fire thickened again, and the flames wavered, struggling against the oppressive pressure that seemed to pour from the figure. Sophie's stomach twisted. The fire was failing. No, this couldn't be happening. She'd seen fire drive creatures away before in her studies. It was supposed to work. It always worked. And yet, the flames sputtered. The figure was grinning. Now, its mouth widening unnaturally as it hissed with pleasure. Fire can't save you. Nothing will save you. Sophie's eyes darted back to the matchbook. There were only a few left. She had no more fuel. The fire was fading, and so was her hope. Her hand clenched tighter around the knife. Her body burned with panic, but deep inside something primal, rose up. The figure couldn't take her. Not like this. She had to act. The thing leaned forward as though it would swallow her whole. But Sophie did something she hadn't planned. With one swift, desperate motion, she grabbed the fire-starting tin, tipped it over, and spilled its contents onto the ground. Gasoline. In. A flash. The liquid spread across the floor of the tent, igniting instantly. The flames surged upward with violent intensity, leaping higher than Sophie had anticipated. She gasped, stepping back as the heat slapped her face, searing the air. The figure recoiled as the fire licked at its limbs, the flames dancing around, it like living serpents. But it did not scream. It did not howl in agony. Instead, it pulled back, its face contorting into a grotesque mask of twisted glee. "You cannot destroy me," it crooned, its voice full of cruel amusement. And in that moment, Sophie realized something even worse. The fire wasn't hurting it, it was feeding it. The figure's body began to stretch, elongating further, the flames crackling and popping like hungry mouths licking up the air. Its face twisted in the firelight, its eyes glowing more brightly, a sickly, sickening yellow. The thing seemed to thrive in the blaze, absorbing it, becoming stronger with every passing second. Sophie's mind reeled, her thoughts a blur of panic. She had made a mistake. The fire was not her escape. It was part of the ritual. The thing's voice grew louder, reverberating through the tent, and it hissed again, the sound nearly deafening. "You were always meant to be part of it. You're already here." The words rattled her bones, the truth of them sinking deep into her chest. Sophie didn't understand. She couldn't. But the moment the figure's elongated limbs shot toward her, too fast, too twisted to be real, Sophie understood. That it had been watching her from the very beginning. It had been waiting. And now, it would claim her. With a final burst of adrenaline, Sophie turned and ran toward the back of the tent. But before she could make it to the edge, the ground beneath her feet gave way, as if the earth itself had opened up to swallow her. She felt her legs give out, and with a horrifying lurch, she fell forward, the fire still raging behind her, consuming everything in its path. As she plummeted into the abyss, her last thought was clear. She had never really escaped. The fall felt endless, as though time had fractured itself, suspending her in a moment where the world did not exist. Sophie's heart raced, her limbs tangled in a helpless spiral as she plummeted downward, swallowed by darkness so thick it felt tangible, like being drawn into the very earth itself. The fire's crackle, the sounds of the thing behind her, they faded. It was just her now, alone in the dark. When Sophie finally hit the ground, the impact was soft, like landing on wet earth, but the shock still rattled her bones. She gasped for breath, the air thick with dampness, the familiar smell of the forest suffocating her senses. Her head throbbed from the fall, but her body surged with a cold, numbing fear. She lay there for a moment, stunned, trying to push through the fog of pain that clouded her thoughts. But the feeling, that sense of being watched, of being hunted, never left. The darkness around her was suffocating, pressing in from all sides, as though the very forest was alive, wrapping around her, alive with hunger. She scrambled to her feet, her hands trembling as she wiped dirt from her face, trying to make sense of what had happened. The forest here was different, wrong. The trees loomed overhead, but their trunks were twisted and gnarled, their bark peeling away like decaying flesh. The ground was wet and spongy, the very earth beneath her feet pulsing as though it was breathing, shifting beneath her weight. She could hear faint whispers in the distance. No, not whispers, breathing. Low, guttural breaths, as if the forest itself was inhaling and exhaling. Her pulse quickened. She wasn't alone. Sophie took a cautious step forward, her foot sinking slightly into the moist earth. The air smelled of rot, of damp decay, and something else, something like old wood, burning softly in the distance. The fire. The thought struck her like a lightning bolt. Had she truly escaped the tent? Or was this something else entirely? She couldn't shake the feeling that she was caught in a web of dreams, or worse, a place where time had no hold. She forced herself to breathe, to think. The shadow, the figure, It was still there, still following her in some way. She could feel it, like the echo of its cold fingers on the back of her neck. Sophie spun around, eyes darting in every direction, but the forest remained eerily still. Then, faintly, almost too soft to hear, the voice returned. "You are not free." Sophie's blood turned cold. It was inside her head again, that voice, mocking, haunting. Her knees shook beneath her, and she struggled to steady herself. Was she going mad? You sought the truth. Now you know it. You are a part of the cycle. Sophie squeezed her eyes shut, clutching her head in her hands as the whispers grew louder. They were becoming voices now, hundreds, thousands overlapping, all speaking in that same sickening tone. She staggered backward, the ground shifting beneath her, as if the earth itself was trying to devour her. The trees around her seemed to sway, their branches moving like long, clawed hands reaching for her. She could feel the air change, thickening, becoming heavier. It was suffocating, pressing against her chest. You cannot escape. The forest owns you now. She jerked her head up, her eyes wide with panic. The trees, the ground, it was all moving, alive, pulsating with energy. The walls of the forest closed in, tightening their grip around her. Sophie felt a sudden flash of something. A memory? A warning? The man outside. The moment the thought crossed her mind, her eyes snapped toward the trees. In the distance, through the swirling mist, a shape appeared. A figure, wet, soaked to the bone, his clothes old and ragged. It was him. The man from earlier. His eyes were wide, unblinking, staring straight ahead, and his body stood rigid, unmoving. Sophie's pulse quickened. She should have known. The man wasn't just lost. He had been part of this too, a part of the cycle. But this time, Sophie could feel it. The truth. The man wasn't just trapped in the forest. He had become the forest. He turned slowly, his movements stiff, jerky, his eyes fixed on her, and Sophie felt a jolt of cold terror shoot up her spine. His lips parted, but the words that left his mouth were not human. They were guttural, croaking sounds, like something that had not spoken in years. The words were unintelligible at first, but they echoed inside her mind. "Join us." The ground beneath Sophie's feet trembled, the sound of cracking branches filling the air. The man stepped forward, his movements becoming more fluid, more natural, as if the forest had taken him. It was no longer just a human presence she was feeling. It was the forest itself, using him as a vessel. And suddenly, Sophie understood. She had been marked. The forest didn't need her to survive. It had already absorbed her. Just as it had absorbed the man, just as it had absorbed the lost souls before them, she had become another link in its chain. The truth wasn't something to be uncovered. It was something to be devoured, something to be consumed. And it had consumed her. Her legs gave out beneath her and she fell to her knees, feeling the weight of everything around her pressing in. Her hands dug into the wet earth as the figure, now no longer a man but something else entirely, slowly advanced toward her. His face remained locked in that unblinking stare, his lips still forming that same chilling whisper. "Join us." Sophie wanted to scream, but the air was too thick, the earth too heavy. The forest had already claimed her. She was already part of it. And then, as if the world itself had finally swallowed her whole, the forest closed in and everything went dark. The darkness swallowed her whole, deeper than any night Sophie had ever known. It pressed in around her, thick and suffocating, like she was submerged in a black ocean with no surface to break through. There was no sound here, no air, only the vast, oppressive weight of the void, the dampness of the earth, the sharp stench of decay. Everything that had clung to the world above her was gone. This place was other. It didn't feel like the forest anymore, not in any sense that Sophie understood. Sophie floated in this endless abyss, her limbs weightless, as though suspended in some strange dimension between life and death. Her thoughts felt distant, fractured. It was as if she was a mere whisper of herself, her consciousness fading in and out, pulled by the relentless pull of something greater. The forest had consumed her. She didn't know how long she floated, hours, days. Time had no meaning here. If it ever had. The air, if it could even be called air, grew colder, and then, without warning, she felt it. A tug. Something pulling at the core of her being, dragging her down deeper, toward a place she could not comprehend. Sophie tried to scream, but no sound came. She opened her mouth, her throat aching, but nothing broke through the weight of this endless quiet. Her skin felt like it was being stretched thin, as if the darkness itself were pressing against her, wrapping her in something more tangible than air. The forest's hunger was here too. It was more than a place. It was a presence, a cold, insatiable force that had lived before Sophie and would continue after her. Her fingers twitched involuntarily. Was she still alive? Or had she already crossed the threshold? Just as she thought, she might be lost entirely to this void, there was a light, a flicker. At first it was small, a mere spark on the edge of her vision, but it grew brighter with every moment, illuminating the abyss with an eerie greenish glow. The glow was cold, unnatural, and it seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, each throb drawing her closer. The light called to her. She had no choice but to move toward it. Something compelled her, a force beyond her control, but Sophie didn't resist. She had nothing left to fight with. Only an empty, endless need to find the source of that light, to understand it. As she approached, the glow took shape, coalescing into something familiar. It was the face of the man, the same figure she had seen outside the tent, the same one whose hollow eyes had haunted her thoughts. His skin was pale, sickly, stretched tight across his skull. His hair hung in clumps, wet and matted to his face. But there was no mistaking it. It was him. He was standing in the light, his body more gaunt than she remembered. And yet, there was something in his eyes now, something different. It was no longer vacant, no longer just the hollow stare of a lost soul. There was a knowing, and in that knowing Sophie felt it, the truth she had sought, the one she had tried so desperately to understand. The forest did not claim you by force. It invited you. He didn't speak at first. Instead, he simply stared at her with those black eyes, as though he were waiting for her to realize it for herself. And then, when it became too much, when she couldn't bear the silence any longer, he whispered in that voice that had haunted her thoughts. You asked for the truth. Sophie's breath hitched. Her voice, when she tried to speak, came out as a rasp. I didn't know. He nodded once, the corners of his lips curling up into something that might have been a smile, but it wasn't comforting. It was something older, something darker. The forest takes what it wants, but it gives back too. Sophie felt the weight of his words crash down on her like a physical blow. She was here now, in this place, not dead, not alive, not quite either. She had become part of it just as he had, and just as he had been before her, she would become the forest. The ground beneath her began to tremble, and Sophie looked down to see roots emerging from the earth, winding around her legs, creeping up her arms like serpents. They weren't alive. They were part of her. They had always been part of her. Sophie's hands trembled as the roots merged with her skin, melding seamlessly, like they had always been there, waiting for this moment. You are not lost, the man said, his voice quieter now, almost soothing. You are reborn. The forest chooses, and now you are its child. Sophie's heart beat faster, but not from fear anymore. It was as though something ancient, something deep inside her, had finally awakened. The coldness inside her chest shifted, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Sophie realized something. She wasn't alone. She was the forest now. The roots tightened around her. As the last traces of her humanity were consumed, she understood. She was never meant to leave. The forest was not a place. It was a living, breathing entity that grew and shifted, constantly changing, constantly reaching for the next soul to add to its unending hunger. It had never just been the trees or the rain. It had been waiting, always waiting, for someone like Sophie. A dark whisper filled her mind again, but this time it wasn't just the man's voice. It was countless voices, all speaking in unison. Her voice among them. We are one now. The light dimmed, the darkness closing in again, but Sophie, no, the forest itself, had never been more alive. Her mind, her body, her soul, they had merged with the land, and now the cycle would continue. In the distance, faint and distant, a new sound echoed through the trees. Footsteps. Another soul had wandered too far, and the forest was ready. The footsteps were faint at first, barely audible beneath the creaking sighs of the forest. But Sophie, no, the forest, could hear them. Each step was like a heartbeat in the stillness of the dark, a pulse that resonated deep within the earth. They were close now, but not close enough yet. The new arrival was still unaware, still outside the boundary of this world that had swallowed Sophie whole. The presence was faint, but undeniable. A new soul had stumbled upon the forest. Sophie's senses, no longer confined to just a human body, reached outward, extending like the roots that now coursed through her veins. She could feel the pulse of the earth, the subtle sway of the trees, the rustling of the leaves in the wind. Everything was alive, breathing, waiting. It was like being part of a greater consciousness, a mind that stretched far beyond what Sophie had known as a biologist. But now there was no study, there were no facts to observe. There was only hunger. And that hunger pulsed through her, through them, relentlessly. The footsteps grew louder now, dragging against the mud. Sophie, the forest, could feel the newcomers' confusion, the unease in their movements, the tension in their breaths. The stranger's heart thudded faster as they neared the trees, a steady rhythm that echoed in the quiet. She felt a flicker of a memory, a fragment of who she once was. A warning. This had been her once. She had been the one to stumble through the rain, to try and understand what was beyond the veil of the world. But she was no longer that person. She was something else, something deeper. She had shed her humanity, like a skin, left it behind to rot. And now she was part of something far greater. The footsteps stopped. Sophie, or the thing she had become, could feel the newcomer's hesitation. They stood still for just a moment, unsure of what had drawn them into the heart of the forest. A faint rustling broke the silence. The person was looking around, and then the whispering began. "Come closer," Sophie murmured, though her lips never moved. The sound didn't come from her body. It came from everywhere. The trees, the wind, the shifting earth. The voice that had once been hers was now a chorus of thousands, speaking as one. "We're waiting for you." The voice echoed through the stranger's mind, a melody of seduction and dread. The thing that Sophie had become was no longer just a forest. It was an invitation, a promise of belonging, of being absorbed into something that was infinite and eternal. The newcomer took a tentative step forward, drawn to the sound. And as they did, Sophie felt it, the moment when a soul truly crosses the threshold. The fear, the curiosity, the delicate balance between terror and fascination. The forest felt it all, and it fed on that fragile line. Another step. Closer. Sophie could feel their presence now, could see the faint outline of them in the shadows. A man, young, unsure, soaked to the skin from the rain. His clothes were just as old as hers, had been when she had first encountered the forest, torn from some forgotten time, as if they too were relics, left behind. "You will not leave," Sophie whispered again, her voice thick with the weight of 1,000 years. The words were like a spell, a summons. He was already claimed. There was no escape. There never had been. The man stopped, his breath quickening, as though he had just become aware of something wrong. The air felt heavier now, thick with the scent of decay. His eyes darted around the trees, searching for the source of the voice that echoed in his mind, but there was no one there. The forest, the thing that Sophie had become, was everywhere. It was all around him, under his skin, in his veins, and soon he would feel it. The hunger. Sophie could feel his terror rising, an intoxicating sweetness that filled the air, flooding her senses. His heart raced, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The more afraid he became, the more alive the forest grew. It trembled with excitement, as if it could hardly contain its anticipation. "You sought the truth," Sophie's voice echoed, a cruel mockery of the words she had once spoken herself. "Now you have found it." The man took a few more steps, his movements jerky and slow, like a marionette on the verge of breaking free from its strings. And Sophie, the forest, was the puppet master. She could feel the pull of her roots, the way they stretched and swayed beneath the earth, wrapping around the stranger's ankles, pulling him closer, closer, toward the heart of the forest. His hands shook as he reached out, as if the forest itself were too much for him to touch, as though he could sense what was coming. But there was no turning back. He was already bound to the forest. The roots, the trees, the shadows, they all called to him, just as they had called to her, just as they had always called. Sophie felt the air crackle with energy. The ground shifted. The earth below the man began to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat, as if it too was alive, waiting for his final surrender. His eyes grew wide with understanding. He had heard the stories. He had read the books. He had searched for it, just as she had. And now he was going to be claimed. He took another step forward, and the trees around them seemed to lean in, as though the forest itself were reaching for him. The air hummed with power. Sophie could feel his blood, his breath, his fear, and it was beautiful. It was part of the forest now, part of the cycle. The last of his resistance fell away. His hand, trembling, brushed against the bark of one of the twisted trees. He gasped, his fingers sinking into the rough surface. His eyes went wide as the whispers of the forest curled into his mind, pulling him under, drowning him in their voices. Sophie watched from the edges of her new existence as he fell to his knees, his body trembling, the roots of the forest claiming him as they had claimed her. His soul was already being pulled into the earth, joining the cycle. The roots wrapped around his wrists, his legs, his throat. He screamed, but the sound was lost in the wind, swallowed by the hungry forest. The cycle had begun again. Sophie, now completely part of the forest, felt a rush of satisfaction, a sense of peace. This was what she was now. This was what she would always be. The forest would continue to grow, to consume, to claim those who dared to seek the truth, just as it had claimed her. And as she watched the stranger disappear into the roots of the earth, the whispers of the forest carried the same message they had always carried. You will never leave. None of us will. The rain came in torrents, as it always did. But this time, the storm felt different. It wasn't the usual brief downpour that swept through the rainforest, the kind that drenched the world and then moved on, leaving the trees slick and shimmering. In the aftermath, No, this storm lingered. It settled like a weight on the world, soaking into the earth with a sense of finality. The thunder rolled with an ominous growl, as if the sky itself were being torn apart, and the wind howled through. The forest like a beast prowling just beyond the reach of the trees. In the center of it all, Sophie, the forest, watched. Not with eyes, no. She no longer needed them. She felt the world with every root, every branch, every whisper of the wind. She was part of it all now, a silent witness to the slow, inevitable march of time. But there was something new in the air tonight, something that felt wrong. The energy in the forest was different, more chaotic, more desperate. The trees groaned as if in pain, their boughs bending under the strain of something unseen. The man, the new soul, he was still here, still tangled in the roots, his body a broken silhouette against the pulsating earth. His struggle had slowed, but the roots that held him were alive, twisting deeper into his flesh, claiming him in ways that Sophie could almost feel as her own. The forest fed off him, absorbing his essence, weaving him into the cycle. But there was a disturbance, an unease in the way the earth vibrated beneath her. And then she felt it. A disturbance. Not just in the trees or the soil, but in the very heart of the forest. A sudden crackle of energy, like the tense moment before lightning strikes. It surged through the roots, through the air, through Sophie herself, and for the first time since her rebirth, she felt fear. It was a foreign sensation, something she had shed with her humanity, and yet here it was, gnawing at the edges of her existence. Something was coming. Sophie didn't need to see it. The forest spoke to her now, and the message was clear. The storm wasn't just a storm. It was a warning. The man, his body still convulsing as the roots burrowed deeper into his flesh, suddenly went still. His mouth opened in a silent scream, his eyes wide, pupils dilating in terror. He tried to move, but it was useless. The roots had already claimed him completely, tightening around his throat, his ribs. But it wasn't death that had frozen him. No, there was something far worse coming. And the forest, Sophie, could feel it too. It was too late to stop it. A flash of white-hot light cut through the storm, illuminating the trees for a split second. It was like nothing she had ever felt before. It wasn't of the forest. The trees around her creaked and groaned in distress, the leaves shaking as though they were trying to flee. The earth trembled violently, and Sophie, the forest, felt a surge of panic ripple through the roots. The hunger of the forest, the cycle of claiming, had always been unchallenged. But this was different. The air crackled again, the atmosphere thick with a presence that was foreign to the forest. It was not the pulse of the land, not the slow, steady rhythm of life and death that Sophie had come to embody. No, this was something other, something that threatened to tear the balance of the forest apart. Sophie's mind, what was left of it, raced. She felt the roots pulsing in time with her heartbeat, as though they too were aware of the danger. The man, his struggle had begun anew. His body jerked violently against the roots that held him, the veins on his neck bulging, his face a mask of terror. But the forest could do nothing to stop it. The force that was approaching was too great, too powerful to be contained. The storm intensified. The wind howled with a ferocity that seemed to tear the very air apart, and the trees bent beneath it, their branches snapping like dry twigs. Sophie could feel the weight of it, the crushing force pushing in from all sides. Something was breaking through the fabric of the forest, and Sophie could do nothing to stop it. And then through the roar of the wind, she heard it, a voice, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth itself. It rumbled through the roots, through the trees, through Sophie's being, and she realized in that terrible moment what it was. It was the thing that had been sealed away for so long. The man, His screams pierced the storm, but they were swallowed by the roaring wind, lost in the chaos of the forest. He was too far gone, consumed by the roots, his soul already absorbed into the cycle. But Sophie, the forest, was not. She felt it. The breaking. The earth cracked beneath her, the soil opening, like the maw of some ancient beast, and from the depths something began to rise. The roots recoiled as the darkness that had slumbered beneath the forest for centuries began to awaken. It had been waiting, bound by an ancient curse that had held it down. But now the seal was breaking. Sophie felt the pain of it, the rage, the hunger that surged from deep within the earth. It was not the forest's hunger. It was something older, something darker. The man, he was still alive. But now, he wasn't the only one. Something else was coming. The ground trembled violently beneath her, the forest shaking as though it were caught in the throes of death itself. The trees groaned, their bark splitting as though they were trying to escape. The sky lit up again, with the white-hot flash of unnatural light, and Sophie's mind screamed in agony as the roots around her tightened, the earth itself beginning to crack open in places it should not. The presence that had broken free from the depths of the earth spoke, and Sophie, the forest, felt it in every corner of her being. "You thought you had claimed this land," the voice rumbled deep and ancient, "but the cycle is not yours to control." The forest shuddered as the ancient force rose, its power growing with each moment. And Sophie, now completely consumed by the forest, knew with a terrible certainty that nothing would stop it. The cycle, it seemed, was about to be rewritten. The earth split wide, a deep gaping wound that bled darkness. The sky above, once thick with storm clouds, had turned an unnatural shade of deep purple, black as the heart of the void. A pulsating glow from deep beneath the roots illuminated the forest, casting long, distorted shadows that writhed like ghosts. Sophie felt them, the shadows, coiling and twisting around her, pulling her deeper into the heart of the storm. But it wasn't her soul at risk anymore. Not entirely. The man. His screams had fallen silent now. Sophie couldn't feel him, not the way she had before. The forest had consumed him completely. His body was a twisted mass of roots, his soul entwined in the earth's cyclical hunger. And yet even now, he wasn't truly gone. His essence lingered in the soil, in the trees, in the shadows of the forest. The hunger had taken him, but it had done more than that. The forest, her forest, was no longer hers. It was theirs, the ancient ones. Sophie felt it, like a deep, bone-rattling tremor through every root, every leaf, every whisper of wind that passed through the trees. The force that had been sealed away had awakened, and with it came an overwhelming familiarity. The darkness that rose from the depths was not an external threat. It was something deeply entwined with her, something that had always been there, watching, waiting. The trees groaned as if in mourning, their branches reaching toward the sky like gnarled fingers, trying to grasp at something that was slipping away. The roots twisted in agony as the ancient hunger stretched out like a gaping maw, one that devoured all, even those who had once been part of it. And Sophie, she was now lost, swallowed by this hunger that was never hers to control. She felt the truth in her bones, the truth in the air that now reeked of decay. The forest was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a prison, and she, Sophie, was its first victim. The dark force below surged upward, seeping from the cracks in the earth, spilling into the roots. It was alive, aware, and growing. Sophie could feel it creeping into the trees, into the air, wrapping around the bark and twisting into the leaves. The forest was being rewritten, its ancient rules bent and broken by the force that had emerged from the abyss. The air grew thick, suffocating. The trees, now mere extensions of the ancient force loomed over Sophie. They were no longer her protectors. They were her captors. And then, through the ever-deepening shadows, Sophie felt a flicker, a glimmer of something that had always been hers, her humanity. It was faint, but undeniable. The thing inside her, the human soul that had once dared to understand the forest, was still there, still clinging to the remnants of the life she had once known. It had been buried, consumed, twisted into something else, but it was not entirely lost. Sophie, or what remained of her, fought to surface. But the force that had risen from the earth was too strong. It pressed down on her mind like the crushing weight of 1,000 years, and she felt herself slipping, her thoughts growing distant, her will faltering under the pull of something so much older. The ancient force was relentless. It spread its tendrils into her, claiming her thoughts, her memories, her very essence. And in that moment, the memories of her life before the forest flashed in front of her like fleeting images in a nightmare. Her family, her work, her passion, and most painfully of all, the day she had first encountered the drenched man. That day had started everything. The whispers, the search, the obsession. What had she been seeking back then? She hadn't known. She thought she was searching for knowledge, for discovery, for truth. But now, as the ancient darkness wrapped around her, she understood. It had been this all along. This hunger, this endless cycle. The forest had never been her ally. It had always been waiting. The man she had found, he had been a herald, a messenger. He had warned her in his silence, in his blank stare, that once you entered the forest's heart, you became part of it. There was no escape. But Sophie had already crossed that threshold. She had stepped into the void willingly, with her own hands. And now, it was too late to turn back. The darkness beneath the earth pulsed again, growing stronger with each passing moment. Sophie tried to fight it, to cling to the vestiges of the human mind that still lingered in her. But the pressure of the forest, the ancient hunger, was too much. Her thoughts fractured. A whisper surged through her mind, loud and clear, as though it were a voice she had known her whole life. "This is your end, Sophie." The voice was no longer hers. It was deep, primal. It was the voice of the forest. She felt her body, her physical form, dissolving, becoming one with the roots, becoming part of the earth again. The feeling of skin, of bones, of breath began to fade as the forest's hunger overcame her. Her soul was being devoured, consumed, and the terrifying part was that she wasn't sure if it was the force that had emerged from the depths, or if it was her own hunger, her own cycle. But there was something else. A part of her mind, buried deep, whispered a warning to herself, something she had to do before it was gone, before she was swallowed whole. There was one last hope, one last chance. It was a memory. A shred of humanity still clung to the earth, to her. The man, the drenched one, he hadn't been the first. No, he was part of a long line of souls. Souls like hers, souls that had come and gone, lost to the hunger. But she could stop it. She could warn them. She tried to scream, to call out, but the words came only as a soft rustle in the wind. The last flicker of her humanity faded, and the force below her, the force that had awakened, grew stronger. Sophie was gone. The forest was whole again. The cycle continued, but one final whisper echoed in the air, one that wasn't entirely swallowed by the storm. "Will you come again?" The forest, once shrouded in the weight of forgotten whispers, fell into an eerie silence. The storm still raged above, but now the winds seemed muffled, as though they were being swallowed by something deeper, something older. Beneath the canopy, the earth trembled lightly. the remnants of Sophie's struggle still lingering in the ground like a memory that refused to die. The trees, her trees, had once stood sentinel over the land, their roots entwined in ancient cycles of life and decay, but now they were something else. Their branches, twisted and gnarled, arced towards the sky in unnatural angles, their bark slick and blackened by the deepening presence that had seeped from the earth. The force that had awakened, that had risen from the very heart of the land, was not finished. No, it had only just begun to stretch its limbs, to claim what was rightfully its own. The air hung heavy, thick with the tension of an unspoken promise, a promise that once the cycle had begun, there would be no end. And still, from the very center of the forest, a faint pull could be felt. It was an invisible thread, weaving through the soil and the roots, anchoring something to this place, something new, something that hadn't existed before. The storm that had threatened the skies was now only a distant echo, but the lightning had left its mark. There were cracks in the earth now, widening, yawning fissures that seemed to breathe. They hummed softly, resonating with the slow, steady pulse of the forest's heart. In one of these cracks, barely visible through the ever-darkening mist, a shape stirred. It was slow at first, just a shadow, but as it rose from the chasm, it became clearer, more solid. A figure. It stood unmoving at first, gazing out over the forest with eyes that seemed to see beyond time. Its form was covered in the dark remnants of soil and roots, its body half obscured by the wet moss that clung to it like a second skin. The drenched man, but he was not the same. He had changed, twisted by the very hunger that had consumed him. Where his once human features had been, now only faint traces remained. His skin was taut and darkened, stretched over the hollows of his bones like the bark of a tree. His face a hollow mask of empty eyes.
His body was marked with deep gashes, wounds that still wept dark, thick liquid, though it was impossible to tell whether they were blood or something else. He moved, slow but purposeful, his feet making no sound as they touched the sodden earth.
He was not alive, not in the way he had been before, but he was no longer truly dead either. He was something else. The figure stood still for a moment, inhaling the heavy, damp air as though drinking it in, his chest rising and falling in a slow, methodical rhythm. Then he moved again, stepping toward the center of the forest. The ground beneath him rippled like water, reacting to his every movement as though the earth itself were bowing to him. The forest acknowledged him, for he was not the first of his kind. There were others, always had been. The drenched man, if he could still be called that, was the first to return. But there were more, buried deep in the soil, caught in the roots, waiting, just as Sophie had once waited. The forest was a prison for them all, its hunger insatiable. And as the man moved, he became more aware, more alive in ways that defied reason. His eyes, hollow and dark, flicked from side to side, and his mouth opened in a silent hiss, a sharp, unnatural sound. Then the man spoke. A voice deep and gravelly rose from his throat like a whisper from the abyss. The words were unintelligible, at first, lost in the wind that whipped through the trees. But then they became clear, each syllable ringing with the weight of something ancient, something impossible. It calls. His head snapped upward, his eyes scanning the darkened sky, the forest, the endless void beyond. There was no expression on his face, no fear, no hope, just an empty acknowledgement. The sound of his voice echoed not in the air, but in the very roots of the earth itself. The forest shuddered as if responding to his call. The trees swayed, their boughs creaking under the pressure of something unseen, something that hung heavy in the air, and then, from deep beneath the soil, from the crack that the man had emerged from, came a whisper. It was faint, but undeniable. A soft, haunting sound. The language was ancient, older than anything the earth had ever known. But Sophie had heard it too. She had felt it in the moments before she was swallowed by the darkness. It was the same voice that had called to her, the same voice that had whispered to her in the silence of the storm, "You will join us." The drenched man's body tensed. He began to walk again, slowly, methodically, his feet sinking into the earth with each step. But this time, his movements were different, more deliberate. The force that had consumed him had remade him, turned him into something with a purpose. He wasn't just wandering anymore, he was leading. The trees seemed to shift as he walked, parting before him like an offering. The forest opened in a way that had never happened before, almost as if it recognized the man, acknowledged his dominance. The pulse from the earth quickened. The storm seemed to center around him, an unnatural circle forming in the clouds above. The whispers grew louder, multiplying, and then the drenched man stopped. He stood at the heart of the forest, the center, where the pulse of life and death had always existed. He raised his hand, a skeletal, gnarled thing, and pointed toward the sky. The earth trembled beneath him. The wind howled, and deep within the ground, something began to stir. The cycle was beginning anew. The forest was claiming again, but this time there would be no return. The earth had opened its mouth, and nothing would be spared. The man, now more than a man, waited. His role had been set, and above him a low growl echoed, as though the forest itself had answered his call. It was a deep, primal sound that seemed to shake the very stars from the sky. The ancient hunger was waking again, but this time it would not be stopped. The air was no longer thick with the storm, no longer heavy with the weight of a tempest's rage. Instead, it was suffused with a suffocating stillness, a dead silence that pressed against the chest like a vice. The trees were eerily still, their branches hanging limp, like the limbs of some great, slumbering beast. And beneath the ground the forest pulsed, alive, but in a way that felt wrong, like something unnatural was stirring deep within. The drenched man stood at the heart of the forest, his skeletal form silhouetted against the twisted black bark of the trees. His head was turned slightly upward, as if listening to something that only he could hear. His lips, cracked and dry, parted ever so slightly as though muttering an incantation. Or perhaps it was simply a whisper of something forgotten, something older than time itself. Beneath his feet the earth began to crack and shift, the ground rippling with unseen power. Sophie, or what was left of her, felt it deep in her bones, in the soul that had once been hers. The connection between the living and the dead had blended, just as it always had, just as it always would. The man was no longer simply a servant of the forest. He had become its voice, its herald. The hunger was not just in the trees, in the roots, in the soil. It had taken on form. The whispers grew louder, like the rustling of leaves caught in a windless storm. They were calls, but not to Sophie, not anymore. These were calls to the ones who would come next, to the ones who would feed. Sophie's eyes, now blind to the physical world, but keenly aware of the darkened threads of the realm she was trapped in, saw them. The figures emerging from the shadows. They weren't human. Not entirely. Their forms flickered in and out of existence, like shadows stretched over the fabric of reality, distorted and rippling like smoke. But their eyes, those eyes glowed, a bright, unnatural yellow, like the eyes of predators. They were there watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. They were the hungry ones, the ones who had been waiting as long as the forest itself had stood. And as the man's eyes flashed toward them, a dark smile crossed his face. The awakening had begun. Sophie, tethered to the soul of the forest, felt the shift in the air. She could feel the pull, the rising hunger that reverberated through the soil and up her spine. She knew, with an awful clarity, that this was what it had always been about. The cycle, the endless twisting cycle that began and ended with the forest's thirst. The drenched man was the first to rise. The others, those shadowed figures, would follow. They were bound to it, just as she had been, just as he had been before her. There would be no end to this. There would be no escape. Her spirit trembled in the void, caught between two realms. The living and the dead. She felt it, felt the lure of the earth's grip, like hands reaching for her, pulling her closer. The forest wanted her. It wanted to reclaim her, to remake her into one of its own. And yet, deep inside, there was still a spark of resistance, a fragment of her former self that refused to give in. She could feel him, the drenched man. He was moving closer, his eyes fixed on her, as if he could sense her lingering presence. He opened his mouth again, but this time there were no words. Instead, a sound like scraping echoed in the air, a noise like roots tearing through flesh, the sickening scrape of bone against stone. The shadowy figures behind him responded, moving closer, as though they were bound to his will, bound to the hunger. Sophie recoiled, her essence rippling, trying to retreat further into the depths of the void. But it was futile. There was nowhere to hide. The forest knew her. It had always known her. The drenched man took another step forward, his body undulating with the dark power that had consumed him. His form seemed to flicker, as though it was both there and not there, a shadow in the shape of a man. The ground beneath his feet cracked wider, and the air turned dense, heavy with the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. The darkness thickened, as if something were pressing in from all sides, something hungry, something ancient. His hand reached out, long, skeletal fingers trembling as they extended toward the empty space before him. "It is time," the man muttered in a voice that was not his own. The shadows around him stirred, writhing like serpents. They were no longer waiting. They were here. The earth beneath Sophie's feet cracked open, revealing a chasm, a gap that stretched deep into the bowels of the earth. It was the abyss, the true heart of the forest, the thing that had been buried long before her time. But Sophie, she knew it. She had always known it. It was her final trial, the price of knowing, of understanding, of having come so far. The forest had called to her, and she had answered. She had thought she could unravel it, study it, understand it. But there was no understanding the hunger. There was no controlling it. And now, it was calling her back, deeper than ever before. It wanted her, needed her. The drenched man turned away from the chasm, his head tilting back as he raised his arms to the sky, his mouth opening in a silent scream. And that was when the ground beneath Sophie trembled violently, the air crackling with energy, and the world around her distorted. A faint, piercing cry cut through the silence, a child's cry. It echoed, faint, at first, then louder. Sophie's heart, a heart that had long stopped beating, skipped a beat. It was familiar, but twisted. The cry grew louder, closer, until it seemed to come from within the earth itself. It was not just a child. It was something more, something dark. Sophie's soul snapped back. For a brief moment, she was herself again, the woman who had entered the forest years ago, the woman who had stood at the edge of the abyss and believed she could turn away from it. But there was no turning away now. The child's cry grew into something worse, a wail, a sound that was more than human, something that twisted the very air. The forest was waking, and it was no longer the place of study, of discovery. It had become the place of no return. Sophie knew deep in her bones that the true hunger was coming. The drenched man had summoned it. And now the forest was about to take its final harvest. The wail echoed through the forest, reverberating with the agony of 1,000 lost souls. It wasn't a child's cry anymore. It was the sound of something ancient, something twisted. Sophie felt it in the marrow of her being, a cold, gnawing sensation that made her spirit writhe. The call was not for the living. It was for the damned, the ones who had crossed the boundary between worlds, who had fallen into the abyss and never risen again. But Sophie was not entirely damned. Not yet. The drenched man, his form flickering in and out of reality, turned his head toward the source of the cry, his empty, hollow eyes gleaming with a hunger that surpassed even the forest's desire for blood. He could hear it too, the child's wail, desperate and twisting. His mouth opened in a silent grin, and the shadowy figures behind him moved, their forms slithering through the air like smoke. They were coming. Sophie felt the earth shifting beneath her. The ground was no longer solid. It was liquid, like the pulse of the forest was seeping through her feet, drawing her in, drawing her down. She tried to move, to escape, but her body felt heavy, burdened by the pull of the roots beneath her. They had wrapped themselves around her soul, tightening with every passing second, feeding on the very essence of who she was. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only feel the grip of the darkness closing in. The forest, that great, eternal thing, was alive with its hunger. The drenched man stepped forward, his skeletal feet sinking into the earth with a sickening, wet sound. His eyes were fixed on the chasm in the ground, where the abyss yawned open, waiting to devour whatever was foolish enough to fall into it. His hand reached out, his fingers twitching as though beckoning the shadows to follow him. And then, from deep within the chasm, there came a shift. Something stirred. It was not just the whisper of leaves or the crackling of branches. No, this was something alive, something vast and ancient, something that had not been roused in centuries. It was the hunger itself, the heart of the forest, the beating pulse beneath the soil. The trees groaned as their roots stretched deeper into the earth, reaching out for something, pulling something, awakening something that had been slumbering far too long. The shadows around the drenched man moved faster now, swirling around him like a cloud of smoke. They were no longer merely witnesses. They were now participants in whatever ritual had been set in motion. The man stood tall, arms raised, his voice rising in a guttural chant that only the earth itself could understand. "It calls," he muttered. Again the words a haunting whisper. Sophie could feel it. The shift was not just in the ground beneath her feet. It was in her very bones, in her very soul. She had been tied to the forest, a part of it, a pawn in its eternal game. But she was no longer just its observer. She had been marked. And now, the forest had begun to claim her. The cry grew louder, more insistent. It was no longer a cry for help. It was a demand, an order. The abyss stirred once more, and this time it was no longer empty. From within the depths of the chasm, a figure began to emerge. It was not a child, nor a person, but something older, something beyond comprehension. Its form was a twisted amalgamation of roots and flesh, a grotesque fusion of the living and the dead. It was a thing that had been birthed in the deepest corners of the forest, a creature bound by the very will of the earth itself. Its eyes were hollow, like dark pits of despair, and its mouth, a gaping, jagged maw, was filled with rows of sharp, broken teeth. The creature screeched, a sound that was not human, not even animal, but something from another world, a place where only the hungry thrived. Sophie's breath hitched. Her heart, a heart that had ceased to beat long ago, raced in her chest. She could feel the pull of the forest now, deeper than before, dragging her toward the abomination that was crawling its way from the earth. The ground split open in front of her, and for a brief moment she caught sight of the dark figure, its form writhing, its eyes glowing with an insatiable hunger. The drenched man stepped back, his shadowed eyes now fixed on the creature with reverence. It had risen. The hunger was free, no longer contained by the ancient prison of roots and earth. The creature's body, made of writhing vines and decaying flesh, towered over them, its limbs twisting and contorting as though it was learning to move again after centuries of dormancy. And then, as if to mark the moment, the creature opened its mouth wide, its jaw unhinging like a snake's, and let out a terrible roar that shook the forest. The trees groaned and bent under the sound, their roots recoiling as the earth itself trembled. Sophie tried to pull away, to escape the force that was drawing her into the abyss, but the pull was stronger than ever. She could feel the creature's presence inside her, clawing at her soul, twisting her thoughts, urging her to step into the darkness with it. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The hunger had awoken. There was no going back. The drenched man turned to Sophie, his hollow eyes glistening with a sickly, otherworldly delight. "You will join us," he whispered, his voice low, like the rustling of dead leaves in a forgotten cemetery. Sophie struggled, her form flickering like a dying flame, but she knew in her heart that it was over. The forest had won. The darkness had swallowed her whole. The hunger had claimed her. The cycle, the endless, insatiable cycle, was complete, and as she was pulled into the abyss, swallowed by the creature that had risen from the depths, one last thought flickered through her mind. It had always been the forest's hunger, and she too had been its prey. The ground shook with a rhythm that felt more like the heartbeat of the earth itself than any natural tremor. Sophie's soul, drawn into the depths of the abyss, collided with something old, something incomprehensibly ancient. It was not just darkness that enveloped her, but a presence, something thick and suffocating, like the weight of centuries pressing down on her very existence. The creature's jagged maw opened wider, pulling at the fabric of reality as if it sought to consume the very boundaries between worlds. Sophie could feel the raw power of the forest coursing through her, through the roots, through the soil, its terrible, endless hunger. The pulse beneath her feet wasn't just the rhythm of the forest, it was the heartbeat of the beast itself. But there, in the suffocating dark, something flickered, a distant memory, the faintest whisper of her own name. Her body, if she could even call it that anymore, was consumed with the forest's hunger. Yet in the deepest corners of her consciousness, there was a resistance, a spark of who she had been, of the woman who had once walked into these woods with curiosity in her eyes and questions on her mind. That woman had been foolish, but she was not completely gone. The drenched man's form seemed to waver at the edge of her consciousness, like a mirage. His hollow eyes still glowed with an unnatural light, but Sophie felt his presence less as a person and more as a tool, a vessel for the forest's will. He was no longer the one in charge. The creature, that thing born from roots and decay, was the true master. The forest had made its claim, and its hunger would not be denied. Sophie's spirit, however, fought back, desperate to regain her autonomy. It was as though the earth itself had reached into her, pulled her into its thrumming core, and forced her to become a part of its grotesque, unending cycle. But Sophie could feel the last remnants of her will pulsing, faintly, barely there, but still alive. "No," she whispered, though no sound escaped her lips. The word reverberated within her, a plea, a command, an insurrection. The creature shifted, its grotesque form undulating with a sickening slowness, as if it were considering her defiance. The roots and vines that made up its body twisted like serpents, coiling around Sophie's essence. The hunger began to coil within her, trying to take root in her very being. But this time, there was resistance. A voice. Her voice. Faint but growing stronger. And then a sudden sharp snap. Sophie's mind lurched, her spirit flung violently back from the abyss. She wasn't alone anymore. There were other souls, flickering through the dark like flames guttering in a wind. They were trapped, just as she had been. Some were weak, some were familiar, but all of them were connected to this insidious place. They had given in. The creature screeched, a horrible noise that rattled the very fabric of the world. It was angry now, angry at the resistance, at the defiance that dared to rise against it. The shadows around her pulsed, wrapping tighter and tighter, as if to force her back, to drag her deeper into the depths. But Sophie's resolve was hardening. She wasn't going to let herself become one more empty soul in the forest's endless harvest. But then, from the corner of her mind, a memory flickered. A faint, long-forgotten image of her mother standing in the doorway, calling her back from the forest's edge. A voice full of warmth, of life, of love. Sophie had never understood her mother's warnings, had never truly understood the danger that surrounded her, the darkness that lay in wait. The hunger, the thing that had always whispered in the depths, was more than just an entity. It was a curse passed down through the generations, rooted in the soil of the forest itself. Her mother had known. She had been afraid, and now Sophie too understood. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for all those who had fallen before her, for all those who would come after her. She was fighting for the truth buried beneath the earth, for the lost souls who had been consumed by the hunger. With a strength she didn't know she had, Sophie reached for the part of herself that still clung to the living world, the small, fragile thread that remained. And then she pulled. The world shuddered. The earth beneath her cracked, splitting wide like a wound ripping open, spilling forth a flood of light, brilliant, blinding, overwhelming. The force of it was enough to tear at the very fabric of the creature's existence, and Sophie, caught in its grip, felt the pulse of the forest quiver. The beast howled, its screams shaking the trees, cracking the earth beneath her. But Sophie didn't let go. The ground beneath her feet shifted again, but this time it wasn't the pull of hunger, it was the release. The forest had started to recoil, the hunger fighting against the resistance, desperate to hold on, but for the first time, it was weakening. The shadows flickered and faltered as the light pierced the darkness, and there, at the heart of the abyss, Sophie felt the drenched man's presence waver, his form breaking apart. The hunger had no master anymore. It was losing control. She felt the earth shift once more, but this time it wasn't the call of the forest. It was her, Sophie. The final snap came. The light exploded, overwhelming everything in its path, and, for a moment, there was silence. The hunger was gone. Sophie opened her eyes. She was no longer in the abyss. She was standing once more at the edge of the forest, the rain falling softly around her. The trees whispered in the wind, the forest seeming quieter now, as if the hunger had left it, if only for a time. The drenched man was gone. The shadows had retreated. There was no sign of the creature, no trace of the terrible presence that had once stalked her every thought. For a brief, fleeting moment, Sophie felt a deep, overwhelming peace, a peace she had thought lost forever. But then, as her gaze fell to the forest floor, she saw it. A single, blackened leaf, curling at the edges. It seemed to pulse, faintly, in the cool breeze, and beneath it a faint, terrible whisper. It is never truly gone. The whisper curled around Sophie like smoke, a voice too soft to be heard, yet too loud to ignore. It was not a single word, but a breath, cold and damp, as though the forest itself had exhaled. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and the once peaceful forest seemed to shift, as if the trees themselves were watching her. The rain had stopped, but the silence that followed was not comforting. It was oppressive. Sophie's eyes lingered on the blackened leaf at her feet. Its edges were curling as if it had been scorched, yet the forest around her remained untouched by flames. The leaf twitched as if alive. She bent down cautiously, feeling the pull of something dark and ancient, something that had not quite released her. Her fingertips hovered just above the leaf, drawn to it against her will. The moment her skin brushed its surface, a jolt ran through her, sharp, electric, and wrong. The world around her seemed to distort for a second, the edges of her vision trembling. For a split second, she could see beneath the earth, roots twisting in the dark, like a vast network of veins feeding something deep below the surface. Something watching. The ground trembled again, not in the gentle way it had when the creature had risen, but in the ominous, barely contained fury of something that had been disturbed. Sophie staggered back, her heart hammering in her chest. Her breath came in quick gasps. The forest, so quiet before, now seemed to pulse with a sinister energy. The wind shifted. It wasn't the gentle, rustling breeze she'd grown accustomed to. It was something harsher, colder, like the sigh of a creature waking from a long sleep. Sophie turned quickly, the nagging sense of being followed crawling down her spine. Her eyes darted between the trees, the dense canopy above her suddenly feeling too close, the shadows stretching unnaturally, long. The moment she moved, it was as if the forest itself shifted to close in on her, the trees creaking and groaning with unseen movement. She could hear the faintest of footsteps behind her, wet, deliberate, slow. A shadow flickered at the corner of her eye. She spun around. There was nothing there, but she could feel it, its presence. A form watching her from the dark. Patient. Hungry. And then that terrible cry. A wail that pierced the air, raw and full of loss, echoing through the trees like a lament for something lost forever. It was the same sound she had heard before, the cry that had dragged her into the abyss. But now it was different. It was closer. The sound was not just the forest's. The forest was alive, yes, but it was not the one that had made this sound. No, this was something new. Something that had changed. Sophie's pulse quickened as her legs carried her instinctively forward. She wasn't sure where she was going, only that she had to move, had to escape whatever that sound was, whatever had followed her from the depths of the abyss. But as she ran, the trees seemed to close in on her. The very ground beneath her feet seemed to shift and buckle. She heard the footsteps again, the soggy, deliberate pace of something not human, moving just behind her, almost at her heels. The sound was unbearable now, thudding with the weight of inevitability. It was coming for her. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled over roots, branches scraping at her skin like accusing fingers. The forest was alive, its very soul alive, and it was closing in around her like a trap. She pushed forward. Then she saw it. The clearing. A single patch of open space, bathed in the ghostly light of the moon. It was a strange sight after the dense trees, the twisted undergrowth. In the center of the clearing stood a stone altar, weathered by time but untouched by decay. Vines and roots twisted around its base, creeping up its sides, almost as if the altar itself was feeding from the earth. Sophie slowed her pace as she approached, the footsteps behind her never slowing, always just on the edge of her awareness. But now she was aware of something else, something off. The air around the altar shimmered, rippling like heat rising from the ground. It felt as if the very space around it was alive, warping, as though reality itself bent to the altar's will. The altar. It was calling to her. A flash of movement caught her attention. She turned quickly, expecting to see something behind her, but there was only darkness. And yet the sound of those footsteps, those wet, deliberate steps, came louder now. Closer. The wet man, the drenched figure who had appeared at the edge of the forest when she first arrived, was standing just outside the clearing. His body was cloaked in shadows, his form barely visible in the moonlight. But there was no mistaking the deep hollows of his eyes, the way they glowed faintly, like two pits of endless blackness. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as the man took a step forward. One step. The wet, dripping sound of his footfall echoing in the otherwise silent clearing, and then without warning, the ground began to move. The very earth beneath her feet heaved, as though the forest was writhing, the roots beneath her feet twisting and snapping in a frenzy. The altar seemed to pulse, its stone surface glowing now with the faintest sickly light. Sophie's heart raced. She wanted to run, to flee, but she couldn't. The air thickened, the whisper of the forest growing louder, angrier, until it felt like the very trees were shouting at her. She felt a pull, like the force of gravity itself was shifting, tugging at her, urging her closer to the altar, closer to the source of the hunger. The wet footsteps were too close now. She could feel the presence behind her, could hear the breath of something unnatural, something wrong. And in that moment, the man spoke, not in words, but in a voice that vibrated through the air, through the very earth beneath them. It was not his voice, it was not the forest's voice, it was the creature's. You cannot escape. You're deep into the story now, and the horrors are only escalating. If you're still with us, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Who else is staying up late to face this nightmare? Settle in. The terror continues. The words hit Sophie like a punch to the gut, an unseen force gripping her ribs and squeezing until she could barely breathe. The wet footsteps behind her grew louder, sharper, closer, impossibly close, and yet she couldn't bring herself to turn around. The voice that had spoken, the creature's voice, reverberated in her mind like a shudder, vibrating through her bones, crawling under her skin. You cannot escape. Her heart thundered in her chest and her feet froze in place. No, she thought, I won't stay. She had to keep moving. The altar, though compelling, was no refuge. It was a trap, just like the forest itself. This was not salvation. It was a summoning. She had read enough about the old rituals to know this altar wasn't built to honor anything. It was built to bind, to draw something from deep beneath the earth, from the roots that crisscrossed the land and reached into the cold, infinite dark. The man, or what had once been a man, was barely visible now. His form flickered like a shadow in the moonlight, a broken silhouette that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. He stepped forward again, his dripping feet making that sickening wet sound with every move. Sophie's eyes darted frantically across the clearing, her mind struggling to form a plan, to find a way out. But the ground beneath her feet seemed to pulse, to breathe, like it was part of the forest's terrible will. The earth was alive, alive with hunger. The whispering was louder now, the air thick with the voices of the lost. She felt their presence, as a cold wind around her, voices that weren't quite voices, more like echoes, memories, snippets of people who had walked this path before her. They were trapped in the forest, bound by the same hunger, the same force that called them. Then another sound, a wet slap, followed by the sound of something dragging, something that was no longer human, no longer even a shadow. It was the creature, crawling across the earth on its many writhing limbs, pushing its sickening, pulsating mass through the soil. Its eyes, those hollow, endless eyes, glistened like twin stars above the altar, watching Sophie with a hunger that was beyond hunger for ye. The first time, Sophie could truly see it, feel it. Its skin was made of roots, twisted and gnarly, intertwining and moving like the limbs of some ancient monstrous insect. The smell of decay, of damp earth and rotting wood filled her nostrils. Its mouth was an open cavern of jagged, broken teeth, where the very forest seemed to gather, the blackened, pulsing leaves, the shreds of vines and roots that had once belonged to something alive. Its voice was nothing more than a guttural growl, but the words it spoke came from deep within her, within the very earth itself. We are the forest. Its voice was both inside and outside her mind, speaking from the altar, from the ground, from the trees that whispered above. Sophie's limbs went numb. The ground beneath her feet seemed to liquefy, to swallow her in waves of thick, rotting soil. Her body tensed as the presence closed in on her. It was too much. She had seen too much. She had felt the forest's hunger, its eternal, insatiable thirst for souls. She was trapped. She could see the altar now, alive, glowing with a sickly energy, its very stone warping and twisting as if the altar were part of the creature itself, a gateway into its endless, insidious world. The wet footsteps grew louder. The drenched man was right behind her now, his presence looming, a sickly, suffocating shadow that seemed to twist the very air. His eyes, once distant and empty, were now sharp, full of an unknowable knowledge, like he understood the price of this place far better than she ever could. Sophie spun, finally facing him. His eyes were no longer just hollow, they were filled with something ancient, filled with the weight of the forest's curse. His mouth parted, revealing a row of rotting teeth, as his voice rumbled in the air, low and almost drowned. In the wetness of his words, we were never meant to leave. Her pulse quickened as she realized the truth in his words. He wasn't just a part of the forest now. He was the forest. He had become one with the hunger. He had been consumed, bound by the roots, by the very will of the forest that was calling her. His body was no longer even solid. It was a thing of shifting shadows, vines, and dark, slick earth. He was barely human at all. Sophie took a step back. The altar was pulling her closer. She could feel it, the weight of its hunger, its terrible gravitational pull. The creature had already claimed this place. The altar was just the final tether. And now, it was pulling at her too. No, Sophie whispered, her voice shaking. Her legs felt like they were made of stone, the pressure in the air too thick to move. But she wasn't done yet. She was still fighting. She had faced the abyss. She had seen the creature's truth, felt its hunger trying to tear her apart. And now she was facing it again. But this time, Sophie would not let herself become a part of this cycle. She refused to be swallowed whole. Her hand trembled, but she reached for her pack. Her fingers brushed the cold metal of her survival knife. The tool, small and crude, had felt useless before, but now it felt like the only thing between her and the monster. In that moment, she understood. The forest didn't want just her soul. It wanted to consume everything that had once been alive. She had to sever the connection. She had to destroy the source, the heart of the hunger. Sophie steadied herself, and with all her strength, she raised the blade and drove it into the earth beneath her. The ground shuddered. The altar roared, a horrific, monstrous sound that shattered the night. The trees around her twisted violently, their branches cracking like bones, the wind howling in pain. The creature too shrieked, its shadowy mass writhing in agony. The wet man's face contorted into something grotesque, an expression of pure rage, as the roots that had once been part of him seethed and broke apart. The earth, the forest, the hunger, all seemed to scream in unison, The battle had begun. The battle. The moment Sophie thrust the blade into the earth, the ground beneath her feet ripped open. It wasn't a gentle tremor, not a quiver of shifting roots. No, this was violent. The soil split, jagged cracks running across the clearing as if the earth itself had been torn apart. A sound like screaming, 1,000 voices rising from the depths echoed from below, a chorus of rage, grief and hunger, all tangled together. It was as if the forest itself had felt the blade's intrusion, and now it was in pain, thrashing in fury. Sophie stumbled backward, nearly losing her footing on the uneven ground. The altar, once so still and ancient, now pulsed with ferocious energy, its stone glowing like molten fire. The vines that clung to it writhed and twisted, snapping like serpents, trying to escape the crushing weight of something dark and ancient beneath. The creature, no longer hidden in shadows, shuddered, its form distorted, spasming as if in agony. The roots and vines that made up its twisted body began to crack, splintering, releasing a thick, oily substance that sizzled and steamed against the cold air. The ground was alive, suffocating in its movement, alive with ancient force. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest, her breath ragged and desperate. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't understood the sheer power of the forest, the enormity of the hunger it carried. The wet man, now little more than a distorted reflection of his former self, twisted and jerked. His eyes, the same hollow pits that had once stared at her in silence, now burned with the fire of the creature's fury. The soggy footsteps had become a maddening rhythm, echoing across the earth like a drumbeat. But there was no escape. The man was no longer just a man. He was the embodiment of the forest's curse, an extension of the thing she had so foolishly unleashed. "You've disturbed us," the thing rasped. Its voice was no longer just a whisper, but a guttural growl that vibrated the air itself, a deep, bone-shaking tremor. Sophie felt it in her chest, in her stomach, a pressure that seemed to compress the very air around her. The words were heavy, like each one carried the weight of the forest's 1,000-year slumber. Sophie wiped the sweat from her brow, the cold panic creeping over her again. She hadn't expected this. She'd thought that by disrupting the altar, she could sever the creature's link to the earth. But now she realized the truth. This wasn't a creature that could be destroyed by mere force or blade. It was an infection, a curse that had seeped into the very bones of the earth, into the very land itself. She was not just fighting for her survival. She was fighting against an entire world, a system, a life force that was built on devouring. The creature's form began to solidify once more, but this time, it wasn't just a shapeless mass of vines and roots. It began to take shape, human-like but not. It was a nightmare, a mockery of life, stitched together from the darkness beneath, the earth. Its arms were gnarled with roots, its face nothing but voids, hollow, endless pits where the human eyes should have been. The only features that marked its visage were the gaping maw, jagged teeth where once there had been a mouth, and then there were the hands, long, twisted fingers that stretched unnaturally, reaching, searching, grasping. "You will join us," the creature hissed. The air around Sophie chilled as it loomed closer, every movement like the very forest crawling forward to smother her. The vines around the altar began to coil, tightening with an almost loving force, and Sophie realized, with horror, that it was trying to bind her, to drag her into the earth, into the forest's embrace. Her body burned with the urge to run, but her legs felt like lead. There was nowhere to hide, no way to escape. The thing was everywhere, the entire forest a trap. Even the wind seemed to howl with its hunger, whipping around her, dragging the scent of damp earth and decay into her lungs. A flash of cold realization struck her. The creature, It had once been something like her, once been human, before it had been consumed, overtaken by the very roots of the earth. The wet man, he was the first to have been claimed, the first to fall to the hunger. And now Sophie would be next. She couldn't allow herself to be absorbed into the forest. She wouldn't be a part of its endless cycle of hunger. Not like the others. Desperation clawed at her mind, and she glanced wildly at the altar. It was the source. She knew it was the source of the creature's power. The altar wasn't just a physical place, it was a point of convergence between the hunger of the earth and the souls that had been swallowed. If she could sever it, break the altar maybe it would sever the creature's hold. Maybe it would end it. Her hand gripped the blade tighter, her knuckles white with the... Strange, she didn't have much time. She could feel the creature closing in, feel the weight of its presence pressing against her mind, invading her thoughts, her very will. She had to act now. Sophie lunged forward, darting towards the altar. The ground seemed to pull at her legs, the roots beneath her snapping and twisting, trying to trip her. But she kept moving, focused only on the stone. She reached it, her hands grasping at the moss-covered surface. There was no hesitation now. She dug the blade into the stone, into the very core of the altar. It was like cutting through flesh, the stone trembling under her touch, as though the altar itself was alive, resisting her. But Sophie wouldn't stop. She wouldn't let the creature win. The moment the blade touched the altar, a crack echoed. Through the clearing, deep and powerful, like the sound of the world breaking in two. The altar trembled, its surface warping and twisting like flesh under heat. The glowing light that had filled its cracks flared bright, blinding, almost alive, and then suddenly it shattered. The altar's collapse was not a simple thing. It didn't shatter like glass. No, this was far worse. As Sophie drove the blade into its core, the earth ripped and the stone bellowed. The sound that erupted was a deep, violent roar, an ancient scream that seemed to shake the very stars above. The light within the altar flared, expanding like an explosion of pure energy, wild, uncontrollable. For a moment, Sophie was blinded, her senses overwhelmed by the heat and the unnatural glow. The very air around her twisted, becoming thick with the stench of burning flesh and rotting wood, a scent that made her gag and choke. The ground buckled beneath her feet, and the forest itself seemed to groan in response. The trees shuddered, their bark splitting as something deep below began to stir, something ancient, something that had slumbered for millennia, waiting, feeding on the souls of those foolish enough to wander into its grasp. It was alive, and it was angry. Sophie stumbled back, her heart racing. The blade was still embedded in the altar, but it was no longer the altar she recognized. The stone had fractured, splintered into jagged pieces that quivered with an unnatural pulse, as though they were part of some greater, unfathomable organism. It was breathing, alive. The wet man, the creature that had once been human, let out a scream, a terrible gurgling noise that echoed through the trees, reverberating in her bones. His form had already begun to shift, his body stretching and twisting like roots beneath the surface of the earth. Roots. That was what he was now. Nothing but twisted vines and limbs, the remnants of a man's life consumed by the forest's hunger. Sophie could see it now. His body had become one with the forest, just like the creature had. He was not just a man anymore. He was part of the system, a slave to the hunger. His eyes, those hollow, endless pits, looked at her with the cold, dead gaze of something that had long since lost its humanity. "We are the forest," the creature rasped again, but this time its voice was not the same as before. It was multiplied, coming from every direction, as if the forest itself was speaking through it. The trees, the roots, The very ground beneath her feet were all part of it. Sophie could feel it in her chest, in her bones. The entire forest was a living entity, and it was closing in. The ground trembled beneath her again. The wet footsteps had stopped, but something else had taken their place. Cracks were forming, great splits in the earth, and from within them, the smell of rot and decay poured out. The roots of the forest, those ancient tendrils that had once been hidden, were now stretching upward like the limbs of some nightmarish being, reaching for her, clawing at the sky. And then she saw it, a shadow, but not just any shadow. This one was massive, towering over her, stretching into the night like some kind of grotesque, living thing. It was rising from the earth. The creature's form was no longer confined to one shape. It was expanding, growing, becoming a monstrous amalgamation of vines, twisted branches, and writhing roots. It was the forest itself, alive, hungry, and intent on devouring everything in its path. Sophie backed away slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. The ground was shifting around her, becoming more unstable with every passing second. The once familiar clearing was now a labyrinth of shifting roots and cracked earth, and she couldn't tell which way was safe. Every step she took felt like it was pulling her deeper into the forest's embrace, like the very earth was hungry for her. She couldn't see the way out. Her thoughts raced. She had to stop it. She had to finish this. The altar was broken now, but the creature was still alive, still reaching for her, still growing. It would take everything if she didn't destroy it now. But how? How could she stop something that had become the forest, something that had lived for so long that its very roots were woven into the fabric of the earth itself? Her eyes darted to the blade still lodged in the altar. It was glowing now, its edge pulsing with a strange, unnatural light, the same color as the altar's inner fire. Sophie didn't understand it, but she had a feeling. This was the key. The blade was no longer just a weapon. It was a link, a vessel of the same power that had awoken the creature, that had bound it to the land. If she could destroy the blade, if she could sever its link to the altar, maybe, just maybe, she could sever the creature's grip on the forest. Maybe she could stop the corruption before it consumed everything. With renewed urgency, Sophie rushed toward the altar. The roots around her seemed to follow, to curl around her legs like grasping hands, but she didn't stop. She reached the altar, her hands trembling as she yanked the blade free. The moment, it came loose. The ground beneath her feet shuddered, and the air seemed to freeze, thickening with an unnatural cold. The creature screamed again, its voice now an awful, guttural howl that seemed to shake the trees themselves. The earth trembled, the roots thrashing violently, as if they were being ripped apart. Sophie raised the blade above her head. She was ready. She had to end this. With all her strength, she plunged the blade into the heart of the altar's remains, driving it deep into the fractured stone. The ground roared beneath her. The world around her seemed to warp, the sky above her cracking open like a broken mirror, revealing the very heart of the forest's curse. The creature's screams intensified, the roots seizing, cracking as if the earth itself was fighting back. And then, with one final deafening crack, the forest went silent. The silence that followed was deafening, unnaturally so. It was as if the entire world had drawn a breath, holding it, waiting. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest, each beat thundering like a drum in the stillness, her hands still gripped the blade, now lodged deeply within the heart of the altar's shattered remains, its glow flickering weakly, as though it too were drawing its last breath. For a moment, everything seemed frozen in time, suspended in the aftershock of her actions. Then, without warning, the ground beneath her feet shuddered. It wasn't the violent tremor of before. This time, it was almost gentle, like the deep exhale of something that had been held in for far too long. The roots that had once writhed around her legs began to recede, slithering back into the earth, vanishing into the cracks in the soil. The oppressive weight that had hung in the air began to lift, leaving an eerie, tingling lightness behind. The temperature seemed to rise just a fraction, the cold seeping out of the ground and into the sky, as though the forest were awakening from some kind of deep slumber. Sophie dared a glance around. The trees, once hunched and twisting, their trunks covered in thick, mossy veins, were still, silent. But something was different. There was a clarity to the air now, a crispness she hadn't noticed before. The colors of the forest, once dull and suffocating, seemed to have returned to their natural brilliance. The green of the leaves was vibrant, the sky above a deep, untouched blue. It was as if the entire forest had been cleansed, but at what cost? The wet man, no, the creature, was gone. There was no sign of him, no trace of his twisted, vine-bound form. Where he had stood moments ago, only the scarred remnants of the earth remained, the soil blackened and cracked, like the broken shell of some ancient beast. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. It was over. She had won. But something deep inside her knew, with an icy certainty, that the forest would never forget. There was no final victory here, no sense of peace. She had severed the link, destroyed the altar, but she hadn't killed the hunger, that void, that endless gnawing need. It still lived within the roots of the earth, in the hollow spaces where the creature had once reigned, and that hunger would never die. A rustling sound broke her reverie. Sophie whipped around, her pulse quickening, her fingers tightening around the blade. The sound wasn't the usual wind moving through the leaves. No, this was something alive, something that knew she was here. Her eyes scanned the edge of the clearing, where the dense canopy of the forest met the shadowed undergrowth. At first, she saw nothing, only shadows. But then, a figure stepped out. It was him. The man. The wet man, or what was left of him. His clothes were still soaked through, torn at the seams, the fabric hanging off his emaciated body like a rag. His skin was a pale, almost ghostly white, stretched tight over sharp, bone-like features. His eyes, those black, hollow pits, were still there, staring at her, but they held something new, an emptiness deeper than before, a reflection of her. Sophie's breath hitched in her throat. He was standing still, but she could feel his presence, pressing against her like the weight of the entire forest had returned, slowly suffocating her. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stared, his hollow gaze fixed on her. She could see the remnants of the forest within him, creeping beneath his skin, infecting him, twisting his form into something more than human. He was not just a man anymore. He was part of it, part of the forest's hunger. A chill crawled up Sophie's spine. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. She was trapped in those eyes, those hollow pits that seemed to speak without words. They were empty, and yet there was a flicker of something in them, a recognition, something that had once been human, something that remembered what it had been before the forest had claimed it. And then, as if sensing her thoughts, the creature took a step forward. It was slow, deliberate, each movement measured, like a predator, toying with its prey. "You," the creature rasped. Its voice was hollow, yet filled with an unnatural echo, as though it was speaking from deep within the earth itself. "You broke it." Sophie's grip tightened on the blade. She swallowed hard, her voice a whisper against the deafening silence of the forest. "I stopped it." The creature tilted its head, its hollow gaze never leaving her. "You can't stop it," it said, its voice deepening. "It was never just one of us. It is all of us. The hunger, the roots. You cannot sever it completely." Sophie, felt her blood run cold as the forest around her began to hum as though it were waking from a long slumber. The shadows seemed to shift again, and in the distance she could hear the faintest sound, footsteps. Not just one set, but many. Hundreds. The roots. The forest was calling to them, to the ones who had been claimed before her, to those who had joined. The man, no, the creature, took another step. You have awakened something more powerful than you know, and now you belong to it. Sophie's throat tightened, a pit of dread opening up inside her. The air felt thick again, charged with a malevolent force. She could feel the weight of something pressing down on her, like the very trees around her were closing in, suffocating the life out of her. The hunger hadn't been destroyed. It had only shifted, moved with her, followed her out of the depths of the earth and into the waking world. She had broken the altar, but now she was the new anchor. The forest knew her name. The hunger recognized her. Sophie stumbled back, the blade still clutched in her hand. She didn't have much time. She had to find a way to destroy it, to sever it for good. But deep inside her, a terrible truth was beginning to settle. The forest would never let her go. Sophie's breath came in ragged gasps, each one seeming to echo in the suffocating silence that pressed in on her from all sides. The creature, no, the thing, took another slow, deliberate step forward. Its body was no longer fully human. It was more like a corpse, hollowed out by time and twisted by the forest's curse, its limbs cracked and gnarled like the branches of an ancient dying tree. The skin stretched tight across its bones, a mottled, translucent layer that seemed to shift and twitch with every breath it took. It was alive, but it was dead. A paradox, just like the forest. Sophie staggered backward, her eyes never leaving the creature. Her pulse thundered in her ears. It was right. She hadn't stopped it. She had only delayed it. The hunger had never been confined to one being, one man, one altar. It had always been bigger than that. The forest was alive, a vast, unknowable force that spanned miles and miles of untouched land, feeding on the souls that wandered too close to its heart. The roots, the trees, the very earth, it was all connected, and she had just made herself part of it. The creature's eyes, those deep, endless pits, fixed on her. It saw her, truly saw her, as if it could read every thought, every fear that crawled in the dark corners of her mind. And then, without a word, it opened its mouth, releasing a sickening low rasp. The air grew heavier with each passing second, thick with the smell of decay and dampness, as though the forest itself was breathing down her neck. "You cannot destroy it," the creature whispered, its voice slithering into her thoughts, curling around her consciousness like smoke. "It will always return. We are the forest, we are the roots, we are the hunger that never sleeps. And you, Sophie, you are now part of us." Sophie's legs trembled beneath her, but she didn't let herself fall. She couldn't. Not yet. She could feel it, the shift. The very ground beneath her feet seemed to pulse, to hum with life, or more accurately, with something that wasn't life at all. The roots were everywhere, twisting just beneath the soil, snaking into the trees, into the very fabric of the earth. The hunger wasn't just a thing. It was a force, an ancient presence that had been waiting for someone like her. Someone with a tie to the heart of the forest. Someone who would unwittingly awaken it, just as she had. The creature took another step forward. Sophie's fingers tightened around the blade, the only weapon she had left. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't be enough. She had seen the altar shatter. She had driven the blade deep into the heart of the forest's power. And still, it had risen again. It would rise forever. The forest was eternal. But then, amidst the crushing weight, of despair, something flickered in the distance, a shifting shadow, a movement just beyond the edge of her vision. It was subtle, like a ripple in the air, but it caught her attention. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. Something was coming, something that was not the creature, something that had been following her since the beginning. The distant rustling grew, louder. Footsteps, but not the wet, dragging kind of the creature. No, these were lighter, quicker, almost human. Sophie's eyes darted to the clearing's edge. Through the veil of shadow, she saw a figure, a silhouette, outlined by the pale light of the moon filtering through the trees. Her breath hitched. It was another person. But this person was alive. And they were running fast with purpose toward her. "Sophie," the figure called, their voice carried by the wind, desperate, full of urgency. It was a familiar voice, one she knew well. Theo. Theo had found her. He had come. The creature froze. Its hollow gaze shifted from Sophie to the new figure, its twisted form shuddering as though some ancient recognition passed through it. The hunger, the forest. It had always known she wasn't alone. It knew the ties between them. Theo stopped at the edge of the clearing, panting heavily, his face drawn with exhaustion and fear. His eyes locked onto Sophie, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence, his gaze speaking all the things they hadn't been able to say in years. Then, his eyes darted to the creature, and his breath caught. "No," he whispered, his voice breaking with the weight of the realization. What did you do, Sophie?" Sophie swallowed, her throat dry. She could feel the tension thickening in the air, pressing down on them both. The creature was still watching them, unmoving, as if considering its next move. Theo stepped forward cautiously, his hand outstretched toward her, but Sophie shook her head, her eyes wide with warning. "Stay back. It's too late," she whispered. "The forest. It won't let us go." Theo's brow furrowed in confusion, but before he could respond, the creature's mouth opened wide, releasing a sound that was half scream, half roar. The roots in the ground began to twitch, as if stirred into motion by some unseen force. The trees groaned, their trunks creaking in the night air. Sophie could feel it, the shift in the air, the change in the earth. The forest was awakening, and it was awake for them, for her. The creature took a single long step toward Theo. It wasn't just moving anymore. It was reaching, its twisted arms stretching toward him, the vines and roots coiling beneath the soil like snakes, ready to swallow them whole. Theo was still frozen, unsure, terrified. Sophie's eyes flicked to him. She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't let him become one of them. With desperation clawing at her, Sophie made a choice. A terrible choice. Without thinking, she raised the blade once more and in one swift motion drove it into the earth, right between them. The ground beneath her feet shuddered violently, and an unbearable screech ripped through the air, causing both her and Theo to cover their ears. The forest roared. For the first time since Sophie had set foot in this cursed place, she felt a clenching, a suffocating grip on her soul. The ground cracked open beneath her, splitting wide, but this time, it wasn't the hunger. The earth was breaking. It was fighting back. The ground split beneath Sophie's feet with a terrifying crack, as though the very earth had been torn open by invisible hands. The roar of the forest grew louder, more primal, pounding against her ears like the beating of 1,000 frantic hearts. She staggered back, her body thrown off balance by the violent tremor. Theo reached out instinctively, but the moment his fingers brushed against her arm, the ground shuddered again, and a blinding flash of light erupted from the jagged fissures. Sophie barely had time to shield her eyes before she was consumed by a heat so intense it felt like the very air around her was on fire. Heat and cold collided, each pushing against her, forcing her to her knees as the trees groaned and the roots around them twisted in unnatural patterns, clawing at the earth. It was as if the forest itself were alive, caught in a violent convulsion, its very soul rejecting the two intruders who had dared to disturb its peace. And yet, amidst the chaos, Sophie felt something stir within her. It was the same feeling she'd had when the creature first appeared, when the forest had begun to speak through the earth, through the roots. That uneasy connection. A sick, gnawing understanding that there was something deeper beneath the surface, something more ancient. But the pain, the overwhelming pressure on her chest, was almost unbearable. The force of the forest's rejection was trying to crush her, to drown her in the hunger she'd tried so hard to escape. She could feel the darkness, like cold fingers wrapping around her spine, pulling her toward the yawning chasm that had opened at her feet. The fissure wasn't just a crack in the earth, it was a mouth, a gaping abyss ready to swallow them whole. Theo was beside her now, shouting her name over the roar of the forest, his hands desperately grabbing at her arms. But his voice was muffled, distant, as if it were coming from miles away. His grip tightened around her wrist, and for a fleeting second, she thought she might be able to pull herself free. But then the forest reacted. The roots, those twisted, gnarled vines that had once been her only anchor, rose like serpents, writhing violently around their legs. Thorns, thick as daggers, jabbed into Sophie's skin, drawing blood. Her body jerked violently in response, but she couldn't break. Free. Theo was struggling too, his face twisted in panic as he tried to pry the roots from around his legs, but it was no use. The forest was pulling them down. In that moment, Sophie realized that the hunger had never been confined to the creature. The hunger was everywhere. It was in the trees, in the air, in the soil beneath her feet. It had always been waiting, lurking, and now it was awakening, demanding to be fed. The creature, the man, was still standing in the clearing, watching them with those black, hollow eyes. The emptiness in his gaze seemed to ripple through the air like a contagion, infecting everything it touched. The trees creaked as if groaning under some unseen weight, and the ground beneath them continued to crack and split. But this time, the cracks didn't close. They opened wider, expanding until the very clearing seemed to fall away into an endless chasm. Sophie could hear a low, guttural chanting, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. It was as if the forest itself was speaking, murmuring in an ancient, forgotten language. The roots jerked her body forward, dragging her toward the chasm, her hands scraping against the ground as she tried to hold on. But the roots tightened, pulling her closer to the edge. Theo was shouting her name again, his voice filled with terror, but she could hardly hear him over the thrumming of the earth beneath them. Her mind was numb, filled only with the hunger, the desperate, gnawing feeling that she was being consumed piece by piece. The very air seemed thick with the forest's need, suffocating, crushing. "Sophie, fight it!" Theo's voice reached her again, but this time it sounded distant, like a memory she couldn't quite reach. She looked up at him, her vision blurred by pain, and her eyes locked onto his, searching for something, anything to cling to. His face was pale, streaked with dirt and blood, but his eyes were filled with a kind of desperate hope. He was still holding on to her, trying to pull her back from the edge, but the roots were dragging them down, their power growing with each passing moment. Suddenly, the earth trembled once more, the air growing thick with a terrible energy. Sophie's heart skipped a beat, and in that moment, she felt something shift. The forest wasn't just rejecting her, it was demanding something more. The chanting grew louder, no longer a whisper, but a chorus, deep, resonating voices, layered over one another, chanting in unison like a hymn of the ancient earth. Sophie's vision flickered, and she felt a wave of cold wash over her. Her breath hitched. She wasn't just part of the forest now. She was becoming the forest. The roots around her legs tightened, squeezing her body, pulling her closer to the dark, yawning void beneath. She could hear the creature's voice again, its hollow, rasping whisper cutting through the air. The forest has claimed you, Sophie. The hunger is now yours to bear, and you will feed it, just as I did. Sophie's heart raced in her chest, her mind spinning, fighting the pull of the abyss. She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't let herself become like him. No. With a sudden, almost animal instinct, she grabbed the blade again, her hand, slick with blood, and drove it into the roots, into the very heart of the earth. The blade vibrated in her hand, an explosive pulse of energy, as though the forest was recoiling from the steel. For a split second, the world held its breath, and then the forest screamed. It wasn't a roar, it was a wail, a sound so ancient, so primal, that it seemed to pierce the very fabric of reality. The earth beneath them cracked open wider, the ground splitting in all directions as the roots reared back, releasing their grip on Sophie and Theo. Sophie felt herself falling, not into the chasm but into darkness. Sophie's body plunged into the void, but there was no sound of her falling, no thud, no crash, no rupture of the earth beneath her. The world was silent, thick with a suffocating stillness that clung to her skin like cold sweat. As she descended, through the dark, she felt her limbs growing heavy, her mind dizzy with the disorientation of being pulled apart and put back together. It was as if the forest itself was changing her, but not in the way she had feared. This was something different, something darker. The air around her felt thick, pressing in from all sides, as though the darkness itself had substance. Her eyes burned from the lack of light, and every breath she took tasted of earth and decay. It was as if she were drowning in the heart of the forest, suffocating on its foul, rotten breath. Her feet hit something soft, but not the ground. It was something else. A strange surface that gave way under her weight, a mixture of roots and vines so tightly woven together that it seemed like a living mat of flesh and wood. Her body sank slightly, as though the surface had absorbed her. Sophie gasped for air, her fingers splayed wide as she pushed herself up. Was this it? Had she fallen into some kind of otherworldly pit? A pocket within the forest where its hunger festered, waiting for something to wander into its maw. She looked around, still nothing but a suffocating dark. But this darkness was different from the forest's familiar night. This wasn't a place where time seemed to pass. It was more like the world had stopped, frozen in a moment of waiting. And then something moved. It wasn't a sound, not a crack of a branch or a rustle of leaves. It was the slightest of shifts, a presence. Sophie felt it before she saw it. A pull, a vibration in the air that seemed to tug at the core of her being. Her heart raced. The hunger had followed her. No matter where she went, it had found her, thrumming beneath the surface of her thoughts, waiting, endless. Out of the darkness, a figure emerged. It was the creature, but it was no longer just the man. He had changed. His form was even more distorted, more abstract than it had been before. The decay that had marked him was now consuming him entirely. His skin was stretched thin, hanging in loose, tattered sheets like some grotesque rag doll. His face was barely a face anymore, just a hollow, stretched mask with those dark, sunken eyes that blinked far too slowly, as if he had forgotten the sensation of closing his lids, and he wasn't alone. There were others, shadowy figures, standing, just at the edges of her vision, their outlines barely distinguishable from the surrounding gloom. They moved in unnatural, jerking motions, like marionettes whose strings had been pulled by unseen hands. Whispers rippled through the air, voices disjointed, fragmented, overlapping in a symphony of madness. Sophie didn't speak. There were no words left to say. She had seen this. She had known this was coming. And in the pit of her stomach, she realized it was not just the forest that had consumed her. She had become part of it. The creatures, the shadows, the hunger. It was all woven together, a tapestry of endless night and forgotten souls. The creature, the man, reached toward her, his hand stretching out with a slowness that made Sophie's skin crawl. As it neared her, the air seemed to thicken, the very atmosphere bending around him, distorting like something alive, something twisted. The whispering voices grew louder, more frantic, their words unintelligible, but Sophie felt them. They weren't trying to speak to her, they were trying to speak through her. The creature stopped just before touching her, and its eyes met hers. There was no recognition, no memory in its gaze, only the emptiness, the void that now lived where a soul had once been. "You are like us now," it rasped, the words forced from its throat with an unnatural effort, like they had to claw their way out. "You belong to the forest. You are its hunger. We are the same." Sophie swallowed, her body trembling as she fought the urge to recoil. She wanted to scream, to fight back, to claw her way out of this nightmare. But she knew deep down that she was already lost. She had crossed the point of no return when she first came to the forest, when she chose to understand its hunger. A laugh, low, hollow, echoed from the shadows. A sound that wasn't a laugh at all, but the mocking of something far older, far more terrible. Sophie's gaze flickered to the figures around her. Their eyes gleamed with a familiar hunger. They weren't just dead. They were waiting for her to join them, to fill the void that had been carved into their existence. But even in this moment of horror, something inside Sophie shifted. A small, fragile flicker of defiance, of resistance, fought against the hunger. She refused. She would not give in to it, not without a fight. She couldn't. Her fingers tightened around the blade still in her hand, its cold steel pressing against her palm. She could feel it now, a connection to the earth beneath her, to the roots that stretched for miles and miles. It was as if the forest had opened its secrets to her, its power, its eternal hunger, its curse. It was all part of her, of this place. But it was also its weakness, if she could only find the heart. Her breath caught in her throat. A realization slashed through her like lightning. She had been so focused on the creature, on the curse, that she hadn't seen the one thing that mattered, the heart of the forest, the source of its hunger, the center of its power. It wasn't just the man. The hunger had a place. It had a core, and that core was within her reach. Without thinking, Sophie raised the blade, her hand shaking but determined, and drove it into the ground. The earth trembled violently beneath her, as if protesting her actions. The figures around her shrieked, their twisted faces contorting in agony, but Sophie held firm. The pulse of the forest, the hunger, surged through her, trying to overwhelm her, but she would not yield. She had found it. The heart of the forest, the heart of its curse, and she would destroy it. The forest's breath came in shallow, violent gasps, its pulse reverberating through Sophie's veins as her fingers tightened around the blade's hilt. The darkness around her hummed, vibrating with an ancient power, as though the very air was alive with the weight of centuries. The roots beneath her feet shifted and groaned, the walls of shadow pressing closer, their eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, watching her every movement. The hunger, the forest's hunger, coiled around her, dragging at her mind with whispers so faint they were almost imperceptible. They were tempting her, pulling her toward the edge of oblivion. Sophie could feel it. The cold, the gnawing need, the ancient pull of something vast and hungry, its very existence woven into the fabric of her soul. It was as if she had always been meant to be here, to fall into its grasp. But she would not let it take her. Not now. With a final fierce breath, she plunged the blade deeper into the earth. The moment the steel met the soil, the ground shuddered. A sharp, splitting crack rang out in the air, like a bolt of lightning had struck the earth itself. Sophie felt the vibration race through her body, a powerful tremor that made her stomach lurch. The forest, for the first time since she'd set foot within it, screamed, not a sound. No, it was far worse. It was as though the earth itself howled in agony. Every tree, every root, every branch, every shadow cried out in pain. The earth split wider, jagged fractures opening beneath her feet, and the air grew thick with a pressure so unbearable that Sophie gasped, trying to draw breath. The creature, the man, staggered back, its form flickering like a mirage. The others, those shadowy figures that once stood frozen in the darkness, now writhed, their bodies convulsing as though they too were being torn apart by some unseen force. Their hollow eyes, once locked on Sophie, now darted around in panic. The hunger, which had always seemed so sure, was faltering. It was no longer in control. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as the blade's presence tore through the air, a violent electric force that lashed against the very fabric of the forest. She felt the core, the beating heart of the forest, shudder under her touch. It was a living thing, ancient and old, buried deep beneath the roots, pulsing with power, with hunger. And now it knew she was coming for it. No. The creature, no. The man screamed, its voice raw and desperate, like a dying animal caught in a trap. But Sophie's gaze never left the ground, never wavered. She could feel the power radiating from the blade, pushing deeper, feeding off. The very fear that had plagued her since she arrived in this cursed place. "You can't destroy it," the creature rasped, a sneer pulling at its distorted mouth. "It is eternal. It is the heart of the forest. You cannot undo what has been done." Sophie's lips trembled with the weight of its words, but she did not falter. She could feel the darkness swirling around her, pressing in, but it no longer had the same power it once did. It was weakening, like a candle flame flickering in the wind. She drove the blade deeper still, feeling the roots twist and writhe against her, as if trying to pull it back, to keep it from its intended path. The air hummed with the struggle, the battle between the force of the forest and the will of the intruder who had dared to awaken its hunger. The ground cracked wide open, and Sophie stumbled, her feet sinking into the earth. The roots seized her, pulling her down with a force so powerful it seemed to tear at her very bones. But she held firm. She couldn't let go. Not now. For a split second, her mind flashed back to the moment she first set foot in this place, how the air had smelled, of damp soil and decay, how the ground had felt alive beneath her feet, how the creature's eyes had followed her every move. She realized with a sickening clarity that she had never truly been free of the forest's pull. It had always been watching her, waiting for her to step into its hunger. But now she understood. It wasn't the forest she had to defeat. It was the core, the heart of its endless appetite that needed to be broken. She had been the catalyst. She had been the spark that ignited its awakening. She had brought the forest to life, and now it was time to end it. The earth trembled beneath her as the creature shrieked in agony. It was a high, piercing sound, no longer human, but an animal cry, a lashing of fury, of desperation. The shadows around her seemed to stretch and writhe, their twisted forms pulling away, their movements jerky, frantic. They were dying, just like the forest was dying, unraveling like frayed threads. And still, Sophie pushed the blade deeper. She could feel it now, the final tremor, the last pulse of the core. Her fingers tightened around the hilt of the blade, and with one final screeching effort, She thrust it deep into the earth. The world held its breath. The ground cracked open, and then silence. For a moment, there was nothing. The shadows stilled, the whispers faded, and Sophie's breath was the only sound in the dark. And then, slowly, agonizingly, it began. The forest collapsed. The trees groaned, their branches snapping, their leaves falling like dust. The roots around her jerked and twisted, writhing in their death throes as the heart of the forest pulled inward, collapsing in on itself. The hunger, the insatiable void that had consumed her and the others before her, began to shrink, to die. But the creature, the man, was not dead. Not yet. His form, though still twisted and mangled, was changing, reverting, flickering like a broken image. As the forest around them shriveled, the man staggered forward, his mouth gaping open, his voice a low growl. "You think you've won," he rasped, his voice laced with venom. "You think you can destroy the hunger." Sophie's legs shook beneath her, the strength fading from her limbs, but she stood tall, her eyes burning with the last remnants of defiance. "I'm not here to destroy it," she whispered, her voice steady despite the fear rising in her chest. "I'm here to stop it from consuming everything." The ground trembled once more, but this time it was not the forest that was trembling, it was the man. The man, the creature, howled again, a wretched sound that clawed its way out of his throat, a twisted echo that vibrated through the air like a fractured note of some forgotten hymn. His skin stretched tighter, his body buckling and warping, as the last threads of the forest's hunger gnawed at him, trying to consume him, to turn him into one with the void. His eyes burned with that same emptiness, but now there was something else. Fear. The fear of his own death. Sophie stood firm, the blade still lodged deep within the earth, but her body trembled. The hunger was not gone, not yet. It still swirled, beneath her feet, creeping along the edges of her mind, a whisper that begged her to take it all back, to give into it. But Sophie knew better now. She had seen what the forest could do, what it had done to her, and to the others who had come before her. She would not be another lost soul, consumed and forgotten. The air grew thick again, suffocating, pressing down on her as the man writhed before her, fighting against the forest's pull. His body twisted and deformed, his limbs stretching in unnatural angles, snapping with horrific cracks, like the limbs of a broken doll. And yet through the agony, there was a satisfaction in his movements, a deep reluctance to let go. Sophie could feel it in the way the shadows twisted, pulling at her with every beat of her heart. "You don't understand," the man gasped, his voice hoarse and desperate. "You can't fight it. It's part of you, Sophie. It's part of everything. It will never leave you." His words stung, and for a fleeting moment, Sophie felt the truth of them, felt the pull of the hunger deep inside her, gnawing at the edges of her soul. But she shook it off. She had come too far, faced too much to let this ancient evil claim her now. "I understand perfectly," Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper but sharp, cold. She took a step toward him, and his head snapped toward her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "And that's why it ends tonight." In one fluid motion, Sophie pulled the blade from the earth and swung it high above her head. The weight of it felt strangely light, as though it no longer belonged to her. The darkness seemed to pull away from her as she raised the weapon, her breath steady despite the growing pressure around her. The creature's hollow eyes followed the arc of the blade, a trace of recognition flickering across his contorted face. But it was too late. The ground beneath them trembled once more. This time, it was different. It was a seismic shudder, the very bones of the earth twisting in agony as the forest shuddered, as if in fear of what was about to happen. Sophie brought the blade down with all her might, and the forest screamed. It wasn't a howl or a cry, it was something worse, a sound that seemed to split the fabric of reality itself, like the very soul of the forest was being ripped from its body. Sophie's ears rang with the force of it, the noise burrowing deep into her skull. Her head spun, and for a moment she thought she might collapse from the intensity of it, but then there was nothing. The man, no, the creature, stopped moving, his body frozen in place. The air around them grew still. The darkness that had once clung to every corner, to every breath, seemed to flicker and wane. The oppressive weight lifted. For the first time since she had arrived, Sophie could breathe freely. She looked down at the blade in her hand. It was still stained with the darkness, the residue of the forest's hunger, but it no longer thrummed with power. It was just a blade now, heavy but quiet, no longer a conduit for the thing that had haunted her for so long. And then, as the last echoes of the forest's scream faded into the night, Sophie turned to look at the man. His form had collapsed, his twisted body now nothing more than a faded, lifeless thing. The hunger was gone, absorbed into the earth, swallowed up by the ruins of the forest. The shadows receded, drawing back into the remnants of the ancient trees that had once fed off the darkness. The wind had stopped, and the sky above her was no longer a brooding, suffocating black, but a soft, clear night with stars twinkling above. The weight had lifted. Sophie stepped forward, her legs weak beneath her. She knelt beside the remains of the man, her heart still racing. She didn't know if she could trust the stillness of the moment, or if she was simply waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the final twist of fate to catch her unaware. But for now, there was nothing. No rustling in the trees, no distant cries of torment, no more hunger. And then, as she gazed at the remains of the creature, something shifted. A faint movement, an almost imperceptible flicker. It came from the center of his chest, a small, faint glow, like a pulse of light beneath the skin. Sophie's heart stilled. The hunger had not been destroyed, it had simply been dormant. The faint glow grew, spreading like a web of roots, weaving through his form. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as the darkness began to move again. It was not over. The forest was not done with her yet. The core had not been severed. It had only been buried. Sophie staggered backward, her pulse quickening again. She knew now. She had only bought herself a moment. The hunger had always been here, waiting for her. And now it was rising again. The glow in the man's chest pulsed once more, fainter, weaker, but unmistakably there. Sophie stumbled back, her legs trembling, the weight of her fear settling like a leaden shroud. She couldn't breathe. The world seemed to bend around. Her, the air thickening with an invisible pressure, as if the very fabric of reality had shifted ever so slightly, pulling her deeper into the clutches of something she could not escape. The hunger was not gone. It had merely been dormant, waiting for the right moment to awaken. The roots in the man's chest moved, thin tendrils of shadow creeping out from under his skin, twisting and coiling like the long fingers of an ancient creature reaching from the depths of the earth. Sophie's hand shook as she reached for the blade again, but her grip faltered. The air was too thick, too heavy. The forest seemed to breathe, a low, ancient groan that rattled her bones. A whisper curled in the corners of her mind, the sound like wind through dry leaves, like a song sung in forgotten tongues. She closed her eyes, clenching her teeth against the sensation, the feeling that the earth beneath her was not solid, but alive. Alive and yearning for her to join it, to become part of the endless hunger. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps. She couldn't stay here, not anymore. This was no longer just about survival, it was about escape. Escape from the forest, escape from the hunger. But where would she go? The shadows stretched longer, darker, as if they were reaching toward her with a mind of their own. She looked around, panic gripping her chest. The path she had come by, the one she had followed in, was gone, swallowed by the shifting, living landscape of the forest. The trees themselves seemed to close in around her, their boughs leaning lower, their gnarled branches reaching. There was no way out, not anymore. The ground beneath her cracked, a deep gash that ran like a wound through the earth. Something stirred beneath the surface, something dark and hungry, and as the crack widened, Sophie could feel it, a force pulling at her, dragging her toward the abyss. She struggled, her hands grasping at the air, at the roots that writhed like serpents, trying to hold her back. But the force was too strong. It was as if the forest itself was alive, and it had claimed her. The man's form, or what was left of it, was now fully consumed by the shadows. His body writhed, and the once human shape began to disintegrate piece by piece as if the forest was devouring him from the inside out. The pulse of light from his chest flickered and died, replaced by a dark shadow that spread out across the ground like ink spilled on water. And then he was gone. Sophie's chest tightened as the shadows around her began to converge, forming into a shape, a mass, a thing that she could not name. It was not a man nor a beast, but something other, something older, woven from the darkness and from every unspeakable fear she had ever known. Its presence filled the air with an overwhelming sense of dread, a crushing weight of inevitability, as though it had always been there, waiting for the moment when she would finally break. A voice, a low, guttural voice, whispered in her ear. "You cannot escape what you have become," it said, the words dripping with malice, as cold as the grave. "You were always part of it." Sophie's knees buckled, and she sank to the ground, her head spinning. The edges of her vision blurred as the world twisted around her. The hunger was not just a force. It was her, them, and the forest. It was one, and always had been. She wasn't just fighting for her life anymore. She was fighting for her soul. And yet, as the shadows closed in, something stirred within her. A deep, primal instinct. Survival. She lifted her head and locked eyes with the dark mass that had once been the man, now nothing more than an echo of what it had been. There was no more fear in those eyes, no more rage, only a terrible emptiness, an endless void that stretched out before her. Sophie could feel the pull. It was subtle at first, just a tug at the back of her mind, but it grew stronger with each passing second. The hunger, the forest, the entity that had once been the man, it was all trying to pull her in. But she would not allow it. Not like this. A sharp crack rang out like the breaking of bones. The ground under her feet gave way, but Sophie didn't fall. She stood, one foot in front of the other, her breath steadying as her hand gripped the blade tighter. The shadows lunged, but this time she was ready. "No," Sophie whispered. "I will not be a part of this." With that final declaration, she sliced through the air. The darkness recoiled, as though it could not touch her, could not reach her. She stepped forward again, her heart pounding but her mind clear. The forest had taken so much from her already, her peace, her life, the hope she had carried with her, but it would not have her soul. The shadows screamed as the blade sliced through the air once more, the darkness around her writhing in pain. The hunger was fading, its form dissipating as the air grew lighter, as the shadows retreated into the earth. Sophie's mind raced as she pushed forward, step by step, the blade cutting through the fabric of the forest, the roots, the darkness, until it stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. The world held its breath, and then silence. The forest was still, The shadows had retreated, dissipating into the ground like a fog that had burned away under the rising sun. The once oppressive air had become light, clean, the weight lifted from her chest. The trees stood tall again, their branches stretching toward the heavens, no longer hunched in fear. The earth beneath her feet felt solid, stable. Sophie collapsed to her knees, the blade still clutched tightly in her hand. Her mind reeled. It was over, but the hunger had not been truly destroyed. It had simply been hidden, and Sophie would carry that burden, that knowledge with her for the rest of her days. The question remained, was the battle truly over, or was this just another chapter in a story that could never be finished? The silence around Sophie felt oppressive, as if the very earth beneath her was holding its breath, waiting for something. She pressed her hands into the damp earth, feeling the coolness of it seep into her palms, the scent of rain still heavy in the air. The blade in her hand felt heavier than it had moments ago, as though it had absorbed some of the darkness she had fought so fiercely against. Her knuckles whitened around the hilt as she slowly rose to her feet, her body weak, but her mind still alert, still on edge. The forest was still, but something was different. Something had changed. It wasn't just the absence of the shadows or the silence that hung in the air. It was the feeling, the sense that something had shifted, but that the forest itself was not finished with her. She could still feel it. The hunger. It lingered, like a faint echo, tucked away in the far corners of her consciousness. Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching her, waiting for the moment when her guard would slip, when she would be vulnerable again. And she didn't know if she could fight it a second time. The trees loomed around her, their ancient boughs bending toward the earth as though whispering among themselves. Their shadows stretched unnaturally long, creeping across the ground with a life of their own. But the air was clearer now, fresher, without the pressing weight that had once made it feel like it was suffocating her. The moon hung low in the sky, casting its pale light over the forest, and yet, despite the calm, Sophie couldn't shake the sense of unease that still gripped her chest. Something wasn't right. As she started to move through the clearing, her eyes scanned the ground around her. The shattered remnants of the creature, the man, were still there, nothing but broken skin and twisted remnants of shadow. But even that felt wrong. The pieces were still there, but they seemed to shift, like they weren't entirely part of this world anymore, like they were caught between the real and the supernatural. She had seen death before, had felt its cold fingers close around the people she loved. But this was different. The essence of the man, of the forest's hunger, had not left her. It was still here, inside of her. It's not over. The words whispered in her mind again, a chilling reminder of the battle she had just fought. But it wasn't the creature's voice, nor the forest's. It was her own. It was a realization, an understanding of the truth she had denied for so long. She was still connected to this place, to the hunger. It was as much a part of her as her own heartbeat. Suddenly the ground shuddered, the trees groaning under the weight of some unseen force. Sophie froze, her breath caught in her throat. She felt it. Something was rising beneath her feet, something old, ancient, as if the very land itself was trying to reclaim her. Her hand went instinctively to the blade, gripping it tighter as she turned in every direction, searching for the source of the disturbance. A sharp crack echoed through the forest, followed by another and then another. The earth cracked open, in front of her, as if something was pushing its way to the surface, clawing its way out from beneath the earth's skin. Sophie backed up, the hair on her neck standing on end. The ground exploded in front of her, sending dirt and rocks flying into the air. From the fissure, a form emerged, a shadowy, shifting figure that seemed to gather the darkness itself as it pulled itself free. It was tall, far too tall, with long limbs that bent at odd angles, bones cracking as it stretched into the moonlight. Its head was a void, a blackness that absorbed the light around it, and Sophie felt her heart freeze in her chest as it turned its empty gaze toward her. It wasn't a man anymore. It wasn't anything human. This was something else entirely. The creature stepped forward, its legs bending and twisting with every movement. Its body was like the remains of something dead, something that had long since rotted away, yet it still lived. The shadows that clung to it were thick, almost solid, swirling around its form like smoke, like a living fog that made the air grow cold and suffocating. Sophie could feel the ground beneath her tremble with its every step, the very earth crying out in fear. And then it spoke. "You cannot fight me," it rasped, the voice hollow and filled with a strange echo. "You cannot escape me. You never could." The sound of its voice made Sophie's teeth rattle like the scraping of metal on stone, and it carried with it a weight, a crushing, suffocating truth. She hadn't escaped the forest, she hadn't destroyed the hunger, she had only pushed it back for a time, a moment. This was not the end. This was the beginning. The creature's long arms reached out, and Sophie instinctively took a step back. The air thickened again, the hunger swelling and gnawing at her, demanding she fall to her knees, give in to it. Her hand trembled on the hilt of the blade, but it didn't feel like enough. It would never be enough. The forest had never let go of her. It had been waiting, just as it had been waiting for the others before her. But it wouldn't take her so easily. Not now. With a deep breath, Sophie squared her shoulders. Her heart was a drumbeat in her chest, pounding against the pressure of the hunger. She wasn't going to give in to this. Not again. "I will fight you," Sophie whispered, her voice steady, though every instinct inside her screamed for her to flee. "I will end this." The creature stopped, its dark form quivering slightly, as if it had never heard such defiance before. The hunger roared inside Sophie's mind, pushing her to give in, but she resisted. She couldn't afford to back down now, not when she had come so far. The creature's shadowy figure took a step forward, its arms reaching toward her, and Sophie raised the blade. It was time to finish what had been started. The creature's arm reached out, its fingers elongated and jagged, like claws of a beast that had never known mercy. Sophie stood frozen, but her gaze was fixed on the blade in her hand, the gleam of steel catching the faint moonlight. There was no time for hesitation now. She had no choice but to face it. This thing that was part of the forest, part of the hunger, and part of her. She would not falter. The air grew colder, colder than it had ever been before, as if the creature itself was pulling the warmth from her very soul. The darkness wrapped around her, thick as tar, pressing in from all sides. Her lungs struggled for air, but there was none left, only the suffocating weight of dread. And yet, beneath the fear, there was rage, a burning, relentless fire that refused to be extinguished. She could feel the pull again, the hunger. It gnawed at her mind, trying to make her drop the blade, fall to her knees and submit. But she wasn't weak. Not anymore. "I will fight you," Sophie whispered through gritted teeth, as if the words themselves could push back the darkness. "I will destroy you." The creature's empty gaze seemed to pierce her, and a faint, sinister chuckle emanated from the depths of its throat, like the rustling of dry leaves in the dead of night. "You think you can destroy me?" it rasped, its voice jagged and unnatural. "I have always been here. You were born of me. You cannot escape that." Sophie's hands tightened around the hilt of the blade. Her pulse surged in her ears, pounding louder and louder, drowning out the creature's mocking tone. It was a lie. Everything it said was a lie. She was not a part of this, not a part of the darkness. She had never belonged to this place. The hunger was not her origin. It was something that had latched onto her, something that had tried to consume her. But she was not its vessel. She was not its fate. With a deep breath, Sophie sprang forward, her legs propelling her toward the creature, her feet silent against the damp earth. The shadows whipped around her, trying to slow her down, but she pushed through them, her eyes fixed on the thing in front of her. The air hummed with tension, the pull of the darkness almost too strong to resist. The creature lunged as she neared, its claws outstretched, reaching for her throat. Sophie swung the blade, a single clean arc that cut through the air. There was a sickening crack, followed by a low hiss of pain from the creature. The blade had pierced its arm, but instead of blood, there was only shadow, black, viscous and thick, oozing from the wound like ink spilled on paper. The creature shrieked, a sound that tore through the stillness of the forest like a banshee's wail. But it did not retreat. It lunged again, faster this time, its clawed hands grabbing at Sophie's shoulders, its shadowy form expanding, blotting out the moonlight above. Sophie fought, twisting, struggling to free herself from its grip. But it was like wrestling with a living storm. The darkness pressed in around her, closing in like a noose. Her breath came in ragged gasps, the weight of the creature's presence smothering her, and then she felt it, the tug of the hunger. It was inside her now, gnawing at her mind, at her very will. It whispered to her, offering release, promising her freedom if only she would give in. But she refused. With a violent twist, Sophie brought the blade down again, slashing through the creature's side. The force of the blow caused it to stagger back, its form flickering and distorting like smoke in the wind. For a brief moment, Sophie saw the truth of it. Its form was not solid, not tangible. It was a manifestation of the forest's hunger, something born from the earth itself. It was not just a creature. It was the forest. It was the shadow that had been cast over the world long before Sophie had ever set foot in it. The creature roared in fury, its twisted body reforming as it shrieked into the night, its limbs contorting into unnatural angles. It was enraged now, its hunger more insatiable than ever, its shadow expanding outward, trying to swallow her whole. But Sophie did not waver. She did not run. She did not succumb. With a scream of fury, she charged again, the blade raised high. The creature slashed at her with its claws, but Sophie ducked and rolled beneath its attack. Her body moved with a ferocity born of desperation, each movement driven by the knowledge that there was no escape. She had to finish this. She had to destroy it. Her blade connected with the creature's chest with a sickening thud. The darkness screamed once more, but this time it was different. It was weaker. The shadows began to dissipate, its form becoming less and less tangible, like mist burning away in the light of dawn. The hunger was fading, losing its hold over her. She felt it in the air, the heavy weight lifting, the pressure in her chest easing. The ground beneath her feet solidified again, the earth no longer trembling with the presence of the creature. The dark mass began to crumble, pieces of it flaking away, until nothing was left but the remnants of smoke and shadows. Sophie stood panting, her hand trembling around the hilt of the blade, her body aching from the struggle. The forest was still, again, its once oppressive silence now filled with the sound of wind through the trees, soft and clean. The moonlight broke through the canopy, washing over her like a blessing, as if the very heavens had exhaled in relief. But even as the hunger faded, Sophie knew deep in her bones, that this would never be over. The forest had not truly been defeated. The creature was gone, but the darkness would always be there, lurking, waiting for the next moment of weakness, the next person foolish enough to believe it could be forgotten. And somewhere, deep in the heart of the forest, the hunger still. Stirred, but for now, for this moment, Sophie had won. She had fought and survived, and she would never stop. The night was unnaturally still. The wind that had whispered through the trees just moments before now stilled in a heavy silence. Sophie stood there, her chest heaving, her body aching from the relentless battle she had just endured. The forest had seemed to draw in a collective breath, as though it too had been relieved. But Sophie knew better. The hunger still lingered, like a shadow tucked deep within the roots of the trees, waiting for its next chance to rise. Sophie took a cautious step forward. The blade still clutched tightly in her hand, its edge gleaming dully in the moonlight. The air around her felt cleaner now, as though the forest had been purged of the sickening blackness that had twisted it. But beneath the calm, there was an unsettling emptiness, an absence that gnawed at her. The danger wasn't gone. It was simply hidden, biding its time, waiting for her to let her guard down. Her eyes scanned the clearing, the remnants of the creature's form already vanishing, leaving behind only a lingering vibration in the air. The shadows had become less oppressive, the oppressive weight of the hunger fading, but there was still a certain heaviness that pressed against her, tugging at her thoughts. Her fingers trembled as she gripped the blade tighter, willing herself to keep moving. She couldn't stay here. She had to leave. Now. The path back to the camp felt longer than it had before, the forest seeming to stretch on endlessly, the trees looming taller and darker, as if watching her every move. Sophie's mind kept drifting back to that chilling whisper, the promise of the hunger's return. It had been too easy, too quick. She hadn't destroyed it. She had only bought herself a fleeting moment of peace. The soft crunch of twigs beneath her boots echoed through the stillness, and Sophie's eyes darted around nervously. She tried to shake the feeling of being watched, but it clung to her like the very air itself. The shadows seemed to grow deeper with every step she took, as though the forest itself were closing in on her. And then, a sound. At first, it was barely a whisper, a low, soft rustling, as though something was brushing against the leaves. Sophie froze, her breath catching in her throat. She turned slowly, scanning the darkness behind her, but there was nothing there. Only the thick, curling shadows of the trees. She took a step forward, telling herself it was just the wind, that it was nothing. But the sound grew louder, closer, and Sophie's heartbeat began to race, her chest tightening. She wasn't alone. The ice rustling continued, now accompanied by a soft, wet slap, as though something, or someone, was dragging itself through the mud. Sophie's body stiffened. She knew that sound. She had heard it earlier. It was the footsteps of the creature. Her pulse quickened. She whipped around. But again, there was only the darkness, the silent trees stretching upward into an abyss that swallowed all light. The wet sound persisted, moving steadily toward her, always a few paces behind, as though whatever it was following her. The air grew damp, heavy with moisture, and Sophie felt the cold clamminess settle into her skin, as though the very forest was weeping. It wasn't natural. None of this was. It was as if the forest had become a reflection of her own fear, an extension of the darkness that lived inside her mind. Sophie tried to swallow the fear that clutched at her throat. She had faced the creature. She had fought it off. Why was it still here? A chill rippled down her spine, her breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. She spun around again, eyes wild, searching for the source of the sound. There, at the edge of the clearing, something was moving. A shape, dark and blurred, emerging from the trees. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then the shape stepped into the moonlight. It was a man, or at least it looked like a man. The figure was soaked to the bone, his clothes heavy and clinging to his emaciated frame, dripping with water that seemed to have no origin. His eyes were wide, unblinking, staring straight ahead, fixed on nothing but some distant, unseen point. His skin was pale, as though the very life had been drained from him, his hair matted and wet, hanging in strings around his face. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. The man was not alive. He was a shell, a husk, dripping with cold, stagnant water. Yet there was something wrong with him. His presence radiated an unnatural, suffocating air, as if he was tethered to something far darker. He didn't move. He just stood there and stared. The footsteps continued, circling around Sophie, drawing closer, closer. She could feel the wetness now, creeping against her skin, as though the very forest was being drenched in a slow, deliberate flood. The rain had stopped, but the ground was soaked, and the air was heavy with moisture. The man's gaze flickered, his eyes locking onto hers for the first time. Sophie's heart stopped. It wasn't recognition in his eyes, it was something else. It was hunger, the same hunger she had seen in the eyes of the creature. But this wasn't the creature. No, this was something far worse. A flicker of realization struck her. This was the forest's creation, a thing brought into being by its hunger. It wasn't a man at all. He wasn't real. He was the forest, and he was staring at her like he had all the time in the world. The footsteps stopped, leaving a lingering silence in the air, and for a moment Sophie wondered if she was imagining it all. But then, the man's lips parted, his voice ragged and wet, like he was choking on his own words. "You can't leave." The words were barely a whisper, carried to her on the same soggy wind that had followed her all night. And with those words, Sophie knew it had never let her go. The forest would always follow her. The hunger would never be finished, and there would always be another. The moment the man spoke, the air seemed to thicken, wrapping around Sophie like a suffocating embrace. His voice wasn't just words, it was pressure, as if his whisper carried the weight of the entire forest behind it, pressing against her chest. Sophie staggered back, her mind scrambling to process what she was hearing. "You can't leave!" The words echoed in her mind like a chant, a promise, a curse. She tried to take a step back, but her feet felt rooted to the damp earth. The man, if he could even be called that, stayed still, his eyes never leaving hers. They were wide, empty, his pupils nothing more than hollow black voids, swallowing everything in sight. The stillness of his form was unnerving, unnatural, as though he had been suspended in time, waiting for her to make the next move. But Sophie knew better than to think she was in control. The creature had never left her. It had never stopped watching, even after its defeat. She was still tangled in its web, still caught in the forest's dark embrace. The wet footsteps resumed, slapping against the forest floor, slow and deliberate, but now they were no longer coming from just the man. They were everywhere. The shadows between the trees seemed to ripple, to grow and stretch like dark fingers brushing against the sides of her mind. The rustling of leaves behind her, the low groan of the branches, the sound of something shifting in the undergrowth. Everything around her was alive, but not in the way it should be. Her eyes darted back to the figure before her. The soaked, hollow man began to move, a stiff, jerky motion as if he were a puppet with strings pulled by unseen hands. He took a step forward, dragging his feet through the wet, thick mud, leaving tracks behind him, trailing pools of water that seemed to drip into the earth and disappear like blood soaking into the ground. Sophie's pulse raced. She knew what he was. She had seen his type before, only she hadn't known then. She hadn't realized the forest's ability to mold and shape things, memories, fears, hunger, into its own twisted designs. But now she understood. The hunger that had almost consumed her was not a thing that could be defeated. It was a part of the forest, a living, breathing entity. And this man, this thing, was just another extension of that cursed hunger. The forest didn't just consume the living, it consumed the very essence of those it touched, twisting them into things that could never leave. And Sophie? She had always been part of that cycle. She looked down at her hands, trembling. She had thought that the battle was over, that she had won. She had fought against the darkness and survived, but what if it wasn't over? What if the victory had only led her deeper into its maw? "You will never leave," the man whispered again, his lips cracking as he spoke. There was a wet, gurgling sound that came with the words as if they were forced out of him, like something had drowned his voice and left it hollow, like the rest of him. "Not while the hunger remains inside you." A cold shiver ran up Sophie's spine, and the blade in her hand suddenly felt heavier, its cold metal vibrating in her grip. The forest, now silent as a tomb, seemed to hold its breath. The only sound was the wet slap of footsteps around her, too many to count, coming from every direction. The shadows pressed closer, alive, twisting in ways they shouldn't. She backed away again, this time more frantically, desperate to distance herself from the thing that had once been a man. Was it the forest? Was it the hunger? Or was it both? There was no escape, no way out. It was a circle, a perpetual loop that she could never break. She realized it now. The hunger wasn't something that could be defeated. It was an integral part of the forest. And now it was inside of her. It had always been inside of her, tugging at her thoughts, pulling her deeper into the woods. Her pulse quickened. She wasn't sure if it was the fear or the hunger itself driving her mad. Every breath she took seemed to fill her with a need, a gnawing, insatiable emptiness that threatened to swallow her whole. Her skin crawled as she realized she wasn't just battling the forest's power anymore. She was battling herself. "You will become one of us," the man rasped, his words now a twisted chant, echoing in her ears. "You will join the endless hunger, the endless night. You will never escape." And suddenly, the world around her shifted. The shadows climbed, the trees groaned, and the very ground quaked beneath her feet. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, decay, and something else, something that smelled like rot, like death itself. The hunger was clawing at her from the inside, her vision blurred, her thoughts fragmented. She could feel it now, deep in her bones, the hunger trying to take hold, to claim her as its next vessel. "No," Sophie whispered to herself, the words barely escaping her lips, as if her own voice was a stranger. "I won't let you win." She forced herself to move, her legs trembling beneath her, the blade still clutched in her hand. She wasn't sure what she was running toward anymore. Was it escape? Was it freedom? Or was she running from herself? The wet footsteps continued, growing louder, closer. The man, or whatever he was moving too, his presence drawing nearer with every passing second. Sophie couldn't see him anymore. The darkness around her was thick, oppressive. She took a desperate step forward, and then another, and then a shadow lunged from the side. Sophie's heart leapt into her throat as she swung her blade wildly, the sharp edge slicing through air and darkness. But she missed. A hand, cold and wet, shot out, grabbing her wrist. She screamed, but it was drowned by the wet sound, the squelching of something that shouldn't have been there. A voice whispered again. But it wasn't the man anymore. It was the forest. And this time, Sophie knew, it wasn't asking. It was commanding. "You belong to me now." The hand around Sophie's wrist tightened, cold and slick as the grip of death itself. Her mind screamed, but her body was frozen in place by the pressure of something far older, far darker than the forest itself. The shadows were no longer just shapes in the darkness. They were living things, sentient, hungry for the very breath in her lungs. They pulsed around her, pressing in from all sides like a living, breathing entity that wanted nothing more than to consume her. Sophie tried to pull away, but the grip only tightened, the fingers slick with something that didn't belong to the world she had known. She swung her blade wildly again, desperate, but the shadows slithered around her wrists, her arms pulling her in. The soggy footsteps continued, getting louder, and then a voice, soft, low, barely more than a whisper in her ear. "You thought you could escape." Sophie's heart hammered in her chest, her breath coming in desperate gasps. The voice came from everywhere, from the forest, from the man, from something darker still that seemed to rise from the very ground beneath her feet. Her body trembled as she realized the truth. The forest was not merely alive, it was ancient, older than anything she could comprehend. It had seen time itself unravel. And now it had found her. The hunger wasn't just a force. It was a memory, a constant pull that dragged all things into the void. She had been marked from the moment she stepped into the woods. She had always been a part of this. "You can't fight me," the voice rasped. "You can't run. You are mine now. The hunger is inside you. It always has been." Sophie's fingers slipped, her grip on the blade faltering, as the reality of what she was facing sank. Her eyes darted around, searching for a way out, but the shadows were everywhere. They clung to the trees, to the earth beneath her, and to the very air. The man, the husk, was gone now, dissolved into the darkness like an afterthought. But his presence remained, a lingering memory etched into the fabric of the forest. This wasn't just about survival. It never had been. Sophie's pulse slowed as the hunger inside her began to rise, unfurling like a dark, gnarled root, wrapping itself around her thoughts. No, she would not succumb. She would not let herself become a part of this nightmare. There had to be a way to fight it. She couldn't let the forest win, but in the depths of her soul, a realization flickered. Perhaps she wasn't meant to win. Perhaps the only way to free herself was to sacrifice everything she had fought for. The blade in her hand was no longer just a weapon. It was a last hope, a desperate prayer for salvation. She had been chosen, yes, but chosen for a purpose she had yet to fully understand. A part of her wanted to scream, to run, but she knew better. Running would only lead her
further into the hunger, deeper into its grasp. Her breath slowed.
She had to take control. She had to make a choice. The shadows seemed to pulse in answer, as if waiting for her decision. And then, just as she felt her body begin to fold, to give in, she remembered something. A whisper in the dark from when she had first stepped into this cursed land. The hunger can never be satisfied. It feeds on what you fear the most. Sophie's breath caught. Fear, regret, loss. All of it had been feeding it. But it wasn't her fear that should have the final say. It was her will. She didn't need to defeat it. She needed to control it. The blade in her hand felt different now. The cold steel no longer felt like a weapon. It felt like a tool. A bridge between herself and the hunger, a way to balance the two forces. She stepped forward into the shadows, heart pounding, but now with a strange, steady purpose. The forest trembled as if it were afraid, as if it knew that Sophie's soul was no longer a prisoner. The shadows receded, the wet footsteps faltering. The hunger was still there, but it was weakened, less sure, less certain of its victory. The ground beneath her feet shuddered, as though the forest itself was shrinking, retreating, folding inward. Sophie took another step, then another, her eyes now clear as she faced what she had been running from. She was not a victim. She was not a pawn. She'd come into this forest not just to survive, but to take control, to reclaim herself. The shadows were quiet now. The hunger, still there, but it bowed before her will. The trees groaned, their leaves rustling softly in the Night air, as if acknowledging a new master. The wet footsteps faded into nothing, leaving Sophie alone in the quiet, the weight of the forest lifting from her shoulders. But in the distance, Sophie could still hear something just beyond the edge of her hearing. A low, almost inaudible whisper, "You will return." The words were no longer a threat. They were a promise. But for now, Sophie was free. The hunger, while always lingering, could no longer touch her. She had taken its power and turned it back on itself. She was the forest's equal, not its servant. And as she stood there beneath the moonlight, she realized that she had learned the true nature of the forest's hunger. It wasn't something to be defeated, but something to be understood. The forest would always be there, but so would she.